Hello, and welcome to Blessed Sleep, where faith meets rest through the timeless wisdom of Scripture. Tonight, we will share the journey of a young shepherd named Matthias, a narrative inspired by Psalm 121, one of the songs of ascent sung by pilgrims traveling to Jerusalem. This story explores the profound truth that we are never alone in our journey and teaches us about divine protection, unwavering watchfulness, and the comfort of knowing that the Creator of heaven and earth guards our every step. While you listen, allow these faith-filled words to envelop you, bringing tranquility to your mind and renewal to your spirit. Let the gentle guidance of biblical wisdom lead you to a place of complete peace, resting in the presence of God. If this video blesses you, I would be deeply grateful if you could take a moment to like and subscribe to the channel. Your support allows me to continue sharing God's wisdom through these stories, creating more content designed to bring peace and spiritual refreshment through Scripture-inspired narratives. Now, take a deep breath, settle into the presence of God, and let us begin tonight's journey through this blessed story. The hills of Judea rose like ancient sentinels against the pre-dawn sky, their limestone faces catching the first whisper of light from the east. In the small village of Beth-Zur, nestled between the terraced slopes where olive trees grew in patient rows, the world was beginning to stir. A rooster's call echoed across the stone houses with their flat roofs, where families had slept under the stars during the warm months. The air carried the scent of bread baking in clay ovens, mingling with the sharp, clean smell of morning dew on wild thyme that grew between the rocks. Matthias had been awake for some time, sitting on the roof of his father's house, watching the darkness slowly retreat from the valleys below. He was 17 years old, with the lean build of one who spent his days walking the hills, and eyes that had learned to read the landscape for signs of danger or shelter. His hands, calloused from years of handling the shepherd's staff, rested on his knees as he gazed toward the north, toward Jerusalem. The holy city was 3 days' journey from here, but in his heart it felt both infinitely far and impossibly close. Today was the day he would begin his pilgrimage. For months he had prepared for this journey, saving what little he could from the sale of wool, repairing his sandals, and listening to the stories of those who had made the journey before. But now, as the moment arrived, he felt something stir within him that he had not expected. It was not excitement alone, though that was there. It was not merely anticipation, though he had dreamed of this journey since childhood. It was something deeper, something that made his chest tight and his breath shallow. It was fear. His father, Joash, emerged from the house below, his footsteps familiar on the wooden ladder that led to the roof. The older man said nothing at first, simply coming to stand beside his son, looking out at the same hills that had been the boundary of their world for generations. Joash was a shepherd, as his father had been, and his father before him. The family had tended flocks in these hills since before anyone could remember, and the land had shaped them as surely as wind shapes stone. "The hills are beautiful at this hour," Joash said finally, his voice carrying the rough gentleness of one who spent more time with sheep than with people. "I have watched this same sunrise 10,000 times, and still it moves something in me." Matthias nodded, but did not speak. His father knew him well enough to understand the silence. "You are afraid," Joash said. It was not a question. "Yes," Matthias admitted, and the word seemed to break something open in him. "I have walked these hills my entire life, Abba, I know every path, every water source, every place where bandits might hide. But beyond Beth-Zur, he trailed off, his gesture taking in the vast unknown that lay between this place and Jerusalem. I do not know those paths. I do not know where danger waits, or where I will find shelter, or if I will even reach the city at all. Joash was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice carried a weight that Matthias had rarely heard. Before you were born, I made the same journey. I was younger than you are now, barely 16, and my father had just died. I went to Jerusalem to make an offering at the temple, to say the prayers for the dead, to seek, I do not know what I sought. Peace, perhaps, understanding. He paused, his eyes distant with memory. I was terrified. The hills beyond our village seemed full of shadows, and every stranger on the road seemed a threat. But my mother, your grandmother Hannah, she took my hands before I left, and she sang to me one of the songs of ascent. Do you know it? Matthias shook his head. I will lift up my eyes to the hills, Joash began, his voice taking on the rhythm of ancient poetry. From where does my help come? My help comes from the Lord, who made heaven and earth. He turned to look at his son, and in the growing light, Matthias could see tears in his father's eyes. She told me that the same God who made these hills that frightened me was the God who would walk with me through them, that he who never sleeps nor slumbers would watch over my coming and going from that day forward and forevermore. The words settled into Matthias like seeds finding soil. He had heard the Psalms sung in the synagogue, had memorized portions of the Torah as a boy, but somehow, hearing these words now, spoken by his father in this moment, they felt different. They felt like a promise being handed to him, warm and solid as bread. Did it help? Matthias asked quietly. When you were on the road, afraid in the darkness, did you remember those words? I did more than remember them, Joash said. I lived them, and you will too. He placed his hand on his son's shoulder, and the gesture carried all the blessing and release that words could not hold. Come, your mother has prepared food for your journey, and the sun will not wait for us. They descended from the roof together, and Matthias entered the house where he had spent every day of his life. The interior was dim and cool, the earthen floor swept clean, the walls whitewashed and simple. His mother, Naomi, was wrapping bread in cloth, her movements practiced and sure. She looked up as he entered, and he saw in her face the same mixture of pride and sorrow that every mother must feel when releasing a child into the wider world. I have packed enough for 3 days, she said, her voice steady despite the emotion Matthias could see in her eyes. Bread, dried figs, cheese, there is a skin of wine and another of water. Do not be too proud to ask for food if you need it. Hospitality is a sacred duty, and there is no shame in receiving what is freely given. Yes, Emma, Matthias said, using the familiar term that had been his first word as a child. She came to him then and placed her hands on either side of his face, studying him as if to memorize every feature. You are so young, she whispered, but I suppose I was young too when I first left my father's house to marry yours. We all must leave what we know to find what we seek. She kissed his forehead, and he smelled the familiar scent of her olive oil and herbs and home. The Lord watch between you and me, while we are absent one from another. It was the blessing of Mizpah, the ancient words of Jacob and Laban, and hearing it now, Matthias felt the full weight of what he was undertaking. He was not merely walking to Jerusalem for the festival. He was stepping into his own story, leaving behind the child he had been, and moving toward whatever man he would become. His younger sister, Ruth, appeared in the doorway. barely 10 years old, clutching a small object in her hands. "I made this for you," she said shyly, holding it out. It was a cord of twisted wool, dyed blue with the indigo that grew wild in the hills, with a small stone tied to its center. "So you will remember us." Matthias took it carefully, feeling the rough texture of the wool, the smooth coolness of the stone. "I could never forget you, little one," he said, tying it around his wrist. "And when I return, I will bring you something from the city, perhaps a ribbon for your hair, like the daughters of Jerusalem wear." She smiled at that, and he tousled her hair, grateful for this small moment of lightness before the weight of departure. The sun had cleared the eastern hills by the time Matthias stood at the edge of the village. His father and mother and sister gathered with the few neighbors who had risen early to see him off. Old Eli, who had been making the pilgrimage for 50 years, shuffled forward and pressed something into Matthias's hand. It was a small wooden token, carved with the symbol of a lamp. "For remembrance," Eli said, his voice cracked with age. "The Lord is your keeper. The Lord is your shade on your right hand. He will not let your foot be moved." His rheumy eyes fixed on Matthias with surprising intensity. "Remember that when the night comes, boy, and the night will come, it always does, but so too does the morning." With final embraces and blessings, Matthias turned his face toward the north and began to walk. The road from Beth-Zur was well worn, packed earth that generations of feet had smoothed. It wound down through terraced fields where barley grew in neat rows, past the spring where women would come later to draw water, and out into the broader valley where the land opened up like a scroll being unrolled. For the first hour, Matthias walked with purpose and energy, his staff striking the ground in a steady rhythm, his eyes taking in the familiar landmarks. There was the ancient oak where he had once found shelter during a sudden storm with the sheep. There was the outcropping of rock shaped like a seated man, which the villagers called Lot's uncle in jest. There was the boundary stone that marked the edge of Beth-Zur's traditional lands. And then he passed beyond it, and everything became less familiar. The road continued north, cutting through a landscape that was both similar to what he knew and subtly different. The hills here were steeper, more barren, with less of the careful terracing that marked lands long cultivated. Wild grasses grew between the rocks, and he saw the tracks of jackals in the dust. The sun climbed higher, and the air grew warm, then hot, and he was grateful for the headcloth his mother had insisted he bring, which he now arranged to shield his neck and face. He was not alone on the road. Other travelers moved in both directions, their own stories written in their clothes and bearing. A merchant with a donkey loaded with clay jars passed him, going south, calling out a blessing in the perfunctory way of one who had spoken such words 1,000 times. A woman with a child strapped to her back and another clinging to her skirts walked northward, her face set with determination and exhaustion. 2 young men, brothers by their looks, overtook him with the easy stride of those accustomed to long distances, deep in conversation about the prices of olive oil in Jerusalem. Matthias felt suddenly small and alone, despite the presence of others. These travelers all seemed to know where they were going, to move with confidence through a world that welcomed them. He was acutely aware of his youth, of the fact that he had never been more than 5 miles from Beth-Zur in his entire life, of the trembling in his legs that was not entirely from exertion. By midday, the sun was a weight pressing down on the land, and the road had climbed into a region of bare stone and sparse vegetation. Matthias stopped to rest in the shadow of a large boulder, taking out his water skin and allowing himself 3 careful swallows. Water was precious on this journey, and he had been warned not to drink too freely too early. As he sat there, catching his breath and feeling the sweat cool on his skin, he heard footsteps approaching. An old man appeared around the bend in the road, moving with the measured pace of one who has learned to conserve energy. He wore the simple robe of a pilgrim, much patched and faded, and carried a staff worn smooth by years of use. His beard was white as wool, his face deeply lined, but his eyes were bright and clear. "Peace be upon you, young traveler," the old man said, stopping a respectful distance away. "And upon you, peace," Matthias replied, getting to his feet as courtesy demanded. The old man gestured to the boulder's shade. "Might an old man share your shelter for a moment? The sun is fierce today, and my bones complain more with each passing year." "Of course, please," Matthias said, moving to make room. They sat in companionable silence for a time, both simply breathing and resting. Finally, Matthias asked, "Are you traveling to Jerusalem for the festival?" "I am," the old man said, "as I have done every year since I was younger than you are now. My name is Simeon, from the village of Tekoa." "Matthias, from Beth-Zur," he replied. "This is my first pilgrimage." Simeon nodded knowingly. "Ah, I remember my first journey. I remember the fear and the wonder, all mixed together like wine and water." He took a drink from his own water skin, then offered it to Matthias, who politely declined. "What brings you to Jerusalem, young Matthias? Beyond the festival, I mean. For most who make this journey, there is something deeper pulling them forward." Matthias considered the question. He had not really examined his own motivations beyond the surface desire to see the holy city, to fulfill the commandment to appear before the Lord 3 times a year. But now, prompted by this stranger's gentle inquiry, he found himself speaking more honestly than he had intended. I suppose I want to know if God is real," he said, and then immediately felt embarrassed by the admission. "I do not mean that I doubt. My family has kept the faith for generations. I have learned the prayers, observed the Sabbath, obeyed the commandments. But it has always been something my father taught me, something my mother insisted upon. I want to know for myself. I want to feel it, not just believe it because I was told to." Simeon was quiet for a long moment, and Matthias, worried that he had said something wrong, had revealed himself to be unworthy of this journey. But when the old man spoke, his voice was warm with understanding. "That is the truest reason for any pilgrimage," Simeon said, "not to fulfill an obligation, but to seek a genuine encounter. The holy city has a way of revealing what we need to see, though rarely what we expect to see." He shifted, getting more comfortable against the stone. "Tell me, Matthias, do you know the songs of ascent?" "Some of them," Matthias said. "My father sang one to me this morning, the one about lifting your eyes to the hills." "Ah, yes, the 121st Psalm, a favorite among pilgrims, and for good reason." Simeon closed his eyes and his voice took on the rhythmic quality of recitation. "I will lift up my eyes to the hills. From where does my help come? My help comes from the Lord, who made heaven and earth. He will not let your foot be moved. He who keeps you will not slumber. Behold, he who keeps Israel will neither slumber nor sleep." The words washed over Matthias like cool water, and he found himself listening, not just with his ears, but with something deeper. There was a truth in these words that resonated with a place inside him he had not known existed. "Those words were written by pilgrims like us," Simeon continued, opening his eyes and looking at Matthias with an intensity that was both gentle and penetrating. "People who walked this very road, who felt the fear and uncertainty that you feel now. They looked at these hills and they asked the question that all travelers ask, where will my help come from? Will I be safe? Will I survive? Will anyone care if I fall? Matthias felt his throat tighten because that was exactly what he had been feeling all morning, though he had not had words for it. And the answer they received, Simeon said softly, was not that the journey would be easy, or that danger would not come, or that they would not face darkness and difficulty. The answer was that they would not face it alone, that the God who made these hills that seem so vast and threatening is the same God who watches over each step we take. He will not let your foot be moved. He who keeps you will not slumber. A wind moved through the rocks, carrying with it the scent of wild sage, and in that moment, Matthias felt something shift inside him. It was not a dramatic revelation, not a voice from heaven or a burning bush. It was quieter than that, and somehow more profound. It was simply the sense that these words were true, that they had been true for 1,000 years, and they would be true for him. "Thank you," he said quietly. Simeon smiled and rose to his feet with a slight groan. "No thanks needed, young friend. We pilgrims must help one another. The road is long, and we all stumble from time to time." He adjusted his robe and picked up his staff. "I travel slowly these days, so you will likely pass me by. But perhaps we will meet again in Jerusalem. The city has a way of bringing together those who need to meet." With that, the old man continued up the road, and Matthias watched him go, marveling at how a chance encounter with a stranger could feel like a benediction. After a few more minutes of rest, he too rose and continued his journey. The afternoon stretched long and hot, and the road became more difficult. It climbed steadily now, winding between hills that grew rockier and more forbidding. Matthias's legs ached, and his water skin grew lighter. He passed fewer travelers now, as if the land itself had driven people away, leaving only the most determined to continue. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose, Matthias realized that he had not planned this part of his journey as carefully as he should have. He had assumed he would reach a village or caravanserai by nightfall, but the landscape around him was increasingly desolate. There were no houses, no signs of cultivation, just the endless stone hills marching away in all directions. He quickened his pace, anxiety creeping into his chest. He had heard stories of travelers caught in the wilderness at night, of robbers who waited in the darkness, of wild animals that emerged when the sun went down. His father's blessing seemed suddenly very far away, and the words of the psalm that had brought him such comfort earlier now seemed like wishful thinking. "He will not let your foot be moved." But what did that mean, really? What good were words against the very real dangers of the night? The sun touched the horizon, and the landscape was transformed. Shadows pooled in every depression, and the path ahead became increasingly difficult to see clearly. Matthias stumbled over a stone he had not noticed, catching himself with his staff, and his heart hammered in his chest. He needed to find shelter, needed to find it soon, but where? He rounded a bend and saw, with immense relief, a cluster of palm trees in a small depression off to the right of the road. Where there were palms, there was water. Where there was water, there might be other travelers. He left the road and made his way down the rocky slope, his feet sliding on loose stones, and as he approached, he saw that there was indeed a small spring bubbling up between the rocks, forming a pool no larger than a grain jar, before disappearing back into the earth. And there, sitting beside the spring, was a man. He was perhaps 40 years old, with the weathered face of one who spent most of his time outdoors. His robe was travel-stained, and beside him lay a pack and a short sword in a worn scabbard. He looked up as Matthias approached, his hand moving instinctively toward the weapon before relaxing as he took in the young man's appearance. "Peace," the man said, his voice neutral, assessing. "Peace," Matthias replied, stopping at a respectful distance. "I am seeking a place to rest for the night. Might I share your spring?" The man studied him for a moment longer, then nodded. "There is water enough for both, and the night is long. Come, sit." Matthias approached carefully and settled himself on the opposite side of the spring. He drank gratefully from the cool water, refilling his water skin, and took out some of his bread and cheese. Following the custom of hospitality, he offered some to the stranger, who accepted with a nod of thanks. They ate in silence as the last light faded from the sky. The man finally spoke, his voice quieter now, as if the darkness demanded it. "I am called Daniel. I travel from Hebron to Jerusalem." "Matthias, from Beth-Zur," he replied, "also bound for Jerusalem, for my first pilgrimage." "Your first?" Daniel repeated, and something in his tone made it sound both like a statement and a question. "You are young for such a journey alone." "I am 17, Matthias said, with as much dignity as he could muster. "Old enough." Daniel smiled slightly at that. "Yes, I suppose you are. I was not much older when I first walked this road." He paused, then added, "Though I had not the courage to walk it alone. I traveled with my brothers, and we were all afraid together, which somehow made the fear less." The admission surprised Matthias. This man, with his sword and his weathered confidence, had been afraid? "You thought I would judge you for your fear," Daniel said, reading his expression. "Many do. They believe that faith means the absence of fear, that to trust in God is to never feel doubt or worry." He shook his head. "But that is not faith. That is merely ignorance. Faith is being afraid and choosing to trust anyway." Overhead, the stars had begun to emerge, first a few bright points, then hundreds, then thousands, until the whole dome of heaven was alive with light. Matthias had seen the stars every night of his life, but here, in the wilderness, far from the lamps of the village, they seemed almost overwhelming in their multitude. "The 121st Psalm," Daniel said suddenly. "Do you know it?" Matthias felt a chill run down his spine. This was the second time today that someone had mentioned this particular psalm, and it seemed more than mere coincidence. "Some of it," he admitted. "The sun shall not strike you by day, nor the moon by night," Daniel recited, his eyes on the stars. "The Lord will keep you from all evil. He will keep your life. The Lord will keep your going out and your coming in from this time forth and forevermore." He was quiet for a moment, then said, "I have walked this road many times, Matthias. I have walked it in daylight and in darkness, in safety and in danger, and I have learned that those words are not a promise that we will never face hardship. They are a promise that we will never face it alone." "How do you know?" Matthias asked, and he heard the desperation in his own voice. "How can you be sure?" Daniel turned to look at him, and in the starlight his face was surprisingly gentle. "Because I have been kept," he said simply, "not preserved from all harm, not protected from all suffering, but kept, held, watched over. There have been nights when I thought the darkness would swallow me, when I could not see the path forward, when I was certain I would not see another dawn. And yet here I am. The sun rose again, as it always does, because the one who keeps Israel neither slumbers nor sleeps." They sat in silence after that, each lost in their own thoughts. Matthias wrapped himself in his cloak and lay down on the ground. using his pack as a pillow. The earth was hard and cold beneath him, and he could hear the sounds of the night, the chirping of crickets, the distant call of a jackal, the whisper of wind through the palm fronds. He should have been terrified. He was alone in the wilderness with a stranger who carried a sword far from his home, vulnerable in every way, but instead he found himself thinking about the psalm, about the words that had been spoken to him twice in one day by two different people. I will lift up my eyes to the hills. From where does my help come? He looked up at the hills, dark silhouettes against the star-filled sky, and for the first time he did not see them as obstacles or threats. He saw them as they were, ancient, enduring, solid. They had been here long before he was born, and they would be here long after he died. And the God who had made these hills, who had set them in their places and knew every stone and valley, that same God was aware of him, of Matthias, a young shepherd from a small village, making his way slowly toward Jerusalem. The thought was so vast, so overwhelming, that he felt tears prick his eyes, not from sadness, but from something else, something he could not quite name. It was the feeling of being small and yet not insignificant, of being fragile and yet somehow protected. He will not let your foot be moved. As he drifted toward sleep, he thought he heard Daniel's voice, very soft, singing or praying in the darkness. The words were indistinct, but the tone was one of peace, of settledness, of a man who had made his own journey through fear and had found something solid on the other side. Matthias slept, and his sleep was deep and dreamless. And when he woke to the gray light of pre-dawn, he found Daniel already up and preparing to continue his journey. The older man offered him some dried dates from his pack, and they ate together in the cool of the morning. "Walk in safety, young Matthias," Daniel said as he shouldered his pack and prepared to return to the road. "And remember, when the darkness comes again, and it will come, that you are watched over. Your keeper does not sleep." "Thank you," Matthias said, and meant it with his whole heart. He waited until the sun had fully risen before continuing his own journey, taking his time to wash in the spring, to say his morning prayers, to eat slowly and mindfully. He felt different somehow, though he could not have said exactly how. Calmer, perhaps, more settled in himself. The second day of walking was easier than the first, despite the fact that the road became steeper and more challenging. Matthias found a rhythm, a pace that he could maintain for hours, and his body began to adjust to the demands being placed upon it. He passed through small villages where he was able to refill his water and purchase a bit of fresh bread. The people he met were uniformly kind, offering blessings for his journey, and he began to understand that he was part of a larger movement, a great river of pilgrims all flowing toward the same destination. In one village, he stopped to rest in the shade of a fig tree near the well, and an old woman came to draw water. She saw his travel-worn appearance and his staff, and she smiled, her face creasing into 1,000 friendly wrinkles. "Another pilgrim," she said warmly. "Going up to Jerusalem?" "Yes, grandmother," he said respectfully. "It is a good journey, a holy journey," she said, sitting down beside him with the easy familiarity of age. "I made it many times when I was younger, before my legs grew too weak for such walking. Now I make the pilgrimage in my heart, remembering the city, the temple, the songs of the Levites." She looked at him with eyes that were filmed with age but still sharp. "What do you seek in Jerusalem, young one?" It was the question everyone seemed to ask, and Matthias found that his answer was evolving with each telling. "I seek to know that I am not alone," he said, and was surprised by his own words. "I seek to know that I am seen, that I am watched over, that my life has meaning beyond the small boundaries of my village. The old woman nodded slowly. That is a good seeking, better than those who go merely to be seen by others, to make a show of their righteousness. She reached out and patted his hand, her touch light as a bird. You will find what you seek, I think. Or rather, you will discover that what you seek has already found you. He puzzled over her words as he continued his journey that afternoon. How could something find you before you found it? But as he walked, he began to understand. The psalm, the one that had been following him like a faithful companion since he left Beth-Zur, was not something he was moving toward. It was something that had been present all along, a truth that existed whether he acknowledged it or not. The Lord is your keeper, not will be, but is. Present tense, continuous, eternal. As the sun began to descend on his second day of travel, Matthias saw other pilgrims beginning to gather near a large caravanserai, a walled compound where travelers could rest in safety for the night. He joined them, paying a small coin to the keeper for a place by the fire and a bowl of lentil stew. There were perhaps 20 others there, ranging from families with small children to elderly men traveling in pairs to young women going to Jerusalem to visit relatives. After the meal, as the stars emerged and the air grew cool, someone began to sing. It was one of the songs of ascent, and the melody was familiar to Matthias from the synagogue. Though hearing it here, in the open air, surrounded by fellow travelers, it felt different. One by one, others joined in, their voices blending in harmonies that had been passed down through generations. When I was in distress, I called to the Lord, and he answered me. I lift up my eyes to the hills. From where does my help come? My help comes from the Lord, who made heaven and earth. He will not let your foot be moved. He who keeps you will not slumber. Matthias sang along, his voice joining with the others, and he felt something crack open in his chest. These were not just words anymore. They were testimony. Each person singing had their own reason for being here, their own fears and hopes and questions. Each had looked at the hills and wondered if they would survive the journey. And here they were, all of them, kept and carried and watched over. After the singing faded, people began to settle down for the night, spreading their cloaks on the ground, checking on children, offering quiet blessings to one another. Matthias found a place near the wall where he could lean his back against the stone and look up at the stars. A young man about his own age settled nearby, and they nodded to each other in greeting. After a moment, the young man spoke. "First pilgrimage?" "Yes," Matthias admitted. "You?" "Third," the young man said with a hint of pride. "My name is Tobias. I travel from Bethlehem with my father and uncles." He gestured to a group of men talking in low voices on the other side of the fire. "Matthias, from Beth-Zur." "Alone?" Tobias asked, and there was surprise but also something like respect in his tone. "Alone," Matthias confirmed. They talked for a while, sharing stories of their villages, their families, their reasons for making the journey. Tobias was traveling because his father insisted, a family tradition that was more obligation than desire. He spoke of Jerusalem as a place he had seen many times, that held no particular mystery for him anymore. Matthias listened and realized that he and Tobias were on very different journeys, even though they walked the same road. For Tobias, this was routine, almost mundane. For Matthias, it was transformation, and he understood that the external journey, the physical walking from one place to another, was only part of what was happening. The real journey was interior, invisible, and could not be measured in miles or days. He slept well that night, despite the hard ground and the snoring of his fellow travelers. And in his dreams, he walked through hills that stretched on forever, but he was not afraid, because he knew that each step was seen, each stumble prevented, each moment held in a watchfulness that never ceased. The third day dawned clear and beautiful, and the pilgrims departed the caravanserai in a loose group, some walking quickly and pulling ahead, others moving slowly and falling behind, but all heading in the same direction. The road climbed steadily now, and Matthias could feel the altitude in his breathing, in the coolness of the air, even as the sun rose higher. Around mid-morning, he came to a place where the road passed through a narrow defile between two hills. It was a place that made him instinctively cautious, the kind of place where robbers might wait. He could see evidence of past violence, a broken spear shaft rusting by the roadside, dark stains on the rocks that might have been blood or might have been nothing at all. He was not alone in the defile. Several other pilgrims were passing through at the same time, and their presence gave him comfort. But then, as they emerged from the narrow place into a broader valley, he saw something that made him stop. A man lay beside the road, clearly in distress. He was older, perhaps 60, and his robe was torn. His face was bruised, and he clutched his side as if in pain. The other pilgrims saw him too, and Matthias watched as, one by one, they gave him a wide berth and continued on their way. Some looked guilty, others fearful, perhaps worried that it was a trap, that robbers waited nearby to attack anyone who stopped. Matthias stood still, torn between the desire to help and the fear that held him back. This was exactly the kind of situation his parents had warned him about. Do not be foolish. Do not put yourself in danger for strangers. Trust no one on the road. But then he remembered Simeon at the well, Daniel by the spring, the old woman at the fig tree, all strangers, all willing to share what they had, to offer words of kindness and wisdom to a young man they would never see again. And he remembered the psalm, "The Lord is your keeper. The Lord is your shade on your right hand." He approached the injured man slowly, his hand on his staff, ready to run if necessary. "Peace, friend. Are you hurt?" The man looked up at him, and Matthias saw genuine pain in his eyes, not the calculation of a con man. "Robbers," the man said, his voice weak and strained. "They came from the rocks, took everything, my water, my food, even my sandal." He gestured to his bare foot, bloodied and swollen. Matthias knelt beside him, his heart pounding but his hand steady. He opened his water skin and held it to the man's lips. "Drink slowly," he said, and watched as the man took careful sips, his throat working with desperate gratitude. "Bless you," the man whispered. "Bless you, young one." Matthias examined the man's injuries as best he could. The bruising looked painful, but not life-threatening, and the cut on his foot, though deep, was not bleeding heavily anymore. "Can you walk?" he asked. "I think so, with help." "There is a caravanserai perhaps 2 hours ahead," Matthias said, making his decision. "Lean on me. We will go together." It took them nearly 3 hours to cover the distance, the injured man limping heavily, Matthias bearing much of his weight. By the time they reached the walled compound, both were exhausted. But when Matthias helped the man inside and explained what had happened, the keeper immediately brought water and bandages, and other travelers gathered around with offers of food and assistance. The injured man, whose name was Levi, gripped Matthias's hand with surprising strength. "You stopped when others did not. Why?" Matthias thought of Simeon, of Daniel, of the psalm that had been following him like a faithful companion. "Because I have been shown kindness on this road," he said simply, "and because I believe we are called to be keepers of one another as we are kept by one who never sleeps." Levi's eyes filled with tears. "You sound like my father. He was a Levite, served in the temple. He used to say that the greatest commandment after loving God was to love our neighbor as ourselves. I had forgotten. I have been so focused on my own journey, my own needs, that I had forgotten to see others." They sat together as evening fell, and Levi told his story. He had been a merchant, successful and proud, traveling to Jerusalem not out of devotion, but out of obligation, to be seen by others as righteous. The robbery had stripped him not just of his possessions, but of his pretense, and in his vulnerability he had seen clearly for the first time in years. "Perhaps," he said quietly, "this was the journey I needed to make, not the one I planned, but the one that would teach me what I needed to learn." Matthias spent that night in the caravanserai, and in the morning he helped Levi to his feet, binding his injured foot carefully with strips of cloth. Other pilgrims had donated food and a spare pair of sandals, and Levi was able to continue his journey, though slowly. "Walk with me a while?" Levi asked, and Matthias agreed. They walked together through the morning, two men at different stages of their journeys, but united by the road and by the understanding that had passed between them. Levi spoke of his life in Jerusalem, of the business he had built, of the family he had neglected in his pursuit of wealth and status. Each word seemed to cost him something, as if he were shedding layers of protective armor he had worn for years. "Do you know what frightens me most?" Levi said as they paused to rest in the shade of a terebinth tree. "Not the robbery, not the pain. It is the thought that I might have reached Jerusalem still wearing my mask, still pretending to be someone I am not. At least now I arrive broken, and perhaps that is how we are meant to arrive, not in strength, but in need, not proud, but humble." Matthias listened, and in Levi's words he heard an echo of his own journey. He too had left Beth-Zur wearing a kind of armor, the armor of youth that believes it must appear strong, that fears being seen as weak or uncertain. But with each step, that armor had been stripped away, and what remained was something more true, more real. The psalm speaks of the sun not striking us by day, nor the moon by night, Matthias said, thinking aloud. I used to think that meant we would be protected from all harm. But now I wonder if it means something different, that even when we walk through heat and darkness, even when we are struck and wounded, we are still held, still kept. That the keeping is not about the absence of pain, but about the presence of God in the midst of it. Levi nodded slowly, his eyes distant. Yes, I think that is it exactly. We are not promised an easy road. We are promised a companion on the road. They walked on, and by midday they had reached a point where their paths would diverge. Levi was heading to the house of a cousin in a village to the west, where he could rest and heal before continuing to Jerusalem. Matthias would continue north, toward the holy city. They embraced, and Levi spoke a blessing over Matthias, his voice steady despite the emotion. "May the Lord bless you and keep you. May he make his face shine upon you and be gracious to you. May he lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace." It was the priestly blessing, the words spoken in the temple for generations, and hearing them now in this dusty crossroads from a man who had been stripped of everything and found something more precious, Matthias felt the full weight of their meaning. These were not empty words. They were truth, lived and breathed and tested. "And also to you," Matthias replied, his throat tight. He watched Levi walk away, limping but determined, and then he turned his face north once more and continued his own journey. Part 3. The Transformation. Chapter 1. The Ascent. The road climbed now in earnest, winding up through hills that grew progressively steeper and rockier. Matthias had been walking for 3 days since leaving Beth-Zur, and his body had found a rhythm, a way of moving that conserved energy, while still making steady progress. His feet were blistered, his shoulders ached from carrying his pack, but beneath the physical discomfort was a kind of strength he had not known he possessed. Other pilgrims filled the road now, more with each passing hour. They came from all directions, streams of humanity converging toward the same destination. There were families with children perched on fathers' shoulders, elderly couples moving slowly but steadily, young men traveling in boisterous groups, lone travelers like himself, each wrapped in their own thoughts. The conversations he overheard were a tapestry of languages and dialects. Hebrew and Aramaic predominated, but he heard Greek spoken by Jews from the diaspora, and even some Latin from those who had lived under Roman rule long enough to adopt the conqueror's tongue. There were heated debates about the interpretation of Torah, quiet recitations of prayers, bursts of laughter, and the constant sound of feet on stone, a rhythm like the heartbeat of a great living thing. As the sun reached its zenith, Matthias crested a rise and stopped, his breath catching in his chest. There, spread across the hills before him, was Jerusalem. He had imagined this moment countless times, had tried to picture what he would feel when he first saw the holy city. But nothing had prepared him for the reality. The walls gleamed white in the sunlight, the stones recently cleaned for the festival. The temple rose above everything else, its golden decorations catching the light and throwing it back in flashes that seemed almost divine. From this distance, he could see the court of the Gentiles, the court of the women, the court of Israel, and beyond them, hidden from view but present in his imagination, the Holy of Holies, where the presence of God was said to dwell. Around him, other pilgrims who were seeing the city for the first time had also stopped, and the air was filled with exclamations of wonder and prayers of thanksgiving. An old woman fell to her knees, tears streaming down her face, her hands raised toward the city. A young father lifted his daughter so she could see, pointing out the temple, explaining, in a voice thick with emotion, what she was looking at. Matthias stood very still, letting the moment sink into him. This was not just a city. It was the center of his people's faith, the place where heaven and earth met, where God had chosen to place his name. Every stone in those walls was sacred. Every street had been walked by prophets and kings. Every building held the weight of history and hope. "First time?" a voice said beside him, and he turned to see a middle-aged man with kind eyes and a well-worn travel cloak. "Yes," Matthias said, not trusting himself to say more. "I remember mine," the man said, his gaze on the city. 40 years ago, and I still remember it like it was yesterday. The way the light hits the walls at this hour, the feeling that you are standing at the threshold of something vast and ancient and holy." He glanced at Matthias. "Cherish this moment, young friend. You will see Jerusalem many times in your life, God willing, but you will only see it for the first time once." They stood together in companionable silence, two strangers united by the shared experience of pilgrimage. And then the man moved on, his blessing trailing behind him like a benediction. Matthias took a deep breath and began the final descent toward the city. The closer he came, the more the city revealed itself. He could see now the details that distance had hidden: the guards on the walls, the gates standing open to receive the flood of pilgrims, the crowded streets visible through the openings, the markets and houses and synagogues all pressed together within the protective embrace of the walls. The noise grew too, a constant roar of humanity that was both overwhelming and exhilarating. He entered through the gate of the Essenes on the south side, joining the stream of pilgrims flowing into the city like water into a cistern. The streets were narrow and crowded, lined with houses of stone, their flat roofs crowded with people who had come to watch the pilgrims arrive. Children ran alongside the crowds, begging for coins or offering to guide travelers to lodgings. Merchants called out from their stalls, selling everything from food and water to ritual items needed for temple worship. The sensory overload was almost overwhelming. The smell of cooking meat from the sacrifices mingled with the scent of incense and unwashed bodies and donkey dung and fresh bread. The sound was a cacophony of voices speaking dozens of dialects, of animals bleating and braying, of hammers ringing on metal, of prayers and arguments and laughter and crying. The visual assault was equally intense. Colorful fabrics hanging from windows, the gleam of bronze and gold from merchant stalls, the white robes of priests moving through the crowd, the armor of Roman soldiers standing watch, the endless sea of faces, each one telling its own story. Matthias pressed through the crowds, following the flow of pilgrims toward the Temple Mount. He had no lodging arranged, but that could wait. First, he needed to see it, to stand in the place where God's presence dwelt. The stairs leading up to the Temple Mount were worn smooth by countless feet, and climbing them felt like ascending through layers of time. At the top, he passed through a gate and found himself in the court of the Gentiles, an enormous courtyard that could hold thousands of people, and it did hold thousands. The space was filled with pilgrims from every corner of the known world. He heard accents he did not recognize, saw styles of dress he had never encountered, stood shoulder to shoulder with people who had traveled even farther than he had to reach this place. But what struck him most was the sound. Beneath the noise of the crowd was a deeper sound, a kind of continuous murmur that seemed to rise from the very stones. It was the sound of prayer, of thousands of voices lifted in petition and praise, creating a resonance that he could feel in his chest. He moved through the court slowly, his eyes taking in everything, the money changers conducting their business, exchanging foreign coins for the half-shekel temple tax, the merchants selling doves and sheep and oxen for sacrifice, their stalls filling the air with the smell of animals and hay, the beggars sitting by the walls calling out for alms, the teachers surrounded by circles of students debating fine points of the law. And beyond all this activity, rising above it like a mountain above foothills, was the temple itself. Matthias had heard descriptions, had listened to travelers tell of its grandeur, but nothing could have prepared him for this. The building was massive, constructed of white stone that seemed to glow in the afternoon light. The gates were overlaid with gold and silver, worked into intricate patterns that caught and reflected the sun. The pillars were so thick that 3 men with arms outstretched could not encircle them. Everything about the structure spoke of permanence, of strength, of the glory of God made manifest in stone and metal. He wanted to move closer, to pass through into the inner courts, but he knew he needed to be ritually clean first to prepare himself properly. So he made his way to one of the ritual baths on the Temple Mount, descended into the cool water, and immersed himself completely, speaking the prayers his father had taught him. When he emerged, water streaming from his hair and clothes, he felt different. Cleaner, yes, but also more present, more aware. The ritual had been more than a physical washing. It had been a shedding of the road's dust, a leaving behind of the ordinary world, a preparation to enter into the sacred. He climbed the steps to the inner court, passing through the gate that separated the court of the Gentiles from the court of the women. Here, the crowd was still large but more solemn. People moved with greater care, speaking in quieter voices, their faces reflecting the awareness that they were approaching the very threshold of holiness. Matthias found a place along the wall and simply stood, watching and listening. Around him, people prayed. Some stood with arms outstretched, faces lifted toward heaven. Others knelt, foreheads touching the ground. Some wept openly, their shoulders shaking with emotion. Others smiled with quiet joy, their faces serene. And then, as the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, a sound rose that made everything else fall silent. It was singing. The Levites had taken their places on the steps leading to the inner sanctuary, and they began to chant the afternoon psalm, their voices trained and powerful, filling the entire space with sound. Other voices joined, thousands of pilgrims adding their voices to the ancient words, and the effect was overwhelming. The psalm they sang was one Matthias knew, one he had heard his entire life, but hearing it here, in this place, sung by this multitude, it became something new. The words were alive, vibrant with meaning and power. Behold, bless the Lord, all you servants of the Lord, who stand by night in the house of the Lord. Lift up your hands to the holy place and bless the Lord. Matthias lifted his hands as those around him were doing, and he added his voice to theirs. He was not a trained singer. His voice was rough from years of calling to sheep across hillsides, but it did not matter. In this moment, every voice was equal, every prayer was heard, every heart was seen. The singing continued, psalm after psalm, as the light changed and the shadows lengthened. Priests moved through the inner court, tending the altar of burnt offering where the evening sacrifice was being prepared. The smell of roasting meat and burning incense drifted over the crowd, and Matthias breathed it in deeply, understanding for the first time what it meant to offer something to God, to give up something precious as an act of worship and gratitude. And then, in the midst of the singing and the smoke and the press of the crowd, something shifted inside him. It was not dramatic. There was no voice from heaven, no flash of light, no mystical vision. It was quieter than that, and more profound. It was simply the sense that he was not alone, that he had never been alone, that every step of his journey from Beth-Zur to this place had been watched, guided, protected. The words of the psalm rose in his mind unbidden. I will lift up my eyes to the hills. From where does my help come? My help comes from the Lord, who made heaven and earth. He had lifted his eyes to the hills, had questioned where his help would come from, had wondered if he would survive the journey. And here he stood, whole and safe, surrounded by his people in the holiest place on earth. The help had come, not in the way he had imagined, not through dramatic rescue or divine intervention, but through 1,000 small mercies. The water at the spring, the bread shared by strangers, the wisdom offered by travelers, the strength that returned each morning, the peace that came even in the valley of shadow. He had been kept. The realization brought tears to his eyes, and he did not try to stop them. Around him, others were weeping too, and there was no shame in it. These were tears of recognition, of gratitude, of coming home to a truth that had always been there, but was only now fully understood. He will not let your foot be moved. He who keeps you will not slumber. His foot had not been moved. Yes, he had stumbled. Yes, the way had been difficult. but he had not fallen. Something, someone, had held him steady. Behold, he who keeps Israel will neither slumber nor sleep. While he had slept under the stars, while he had closed his eyes in the darkness and surrendered to rest, he had been watched over. The keeper had not slept. The guardian had not closed his eyes. The Lord is your keeper. The Lord is your shade on your right hand. In the fierce heat of the day there had been shade, not always physical shade, but the protection that came from knowing he was not abandoned, not forgotten, not alone. The sun shall not strike you by day, nor the moon by night. He thought of the night by the spring with Daniel, of sleeping in the wilderness with nothing but a cloak between him and the cold ground. The moon had shone down, bright and silver, but it had not harmed him. The sun had beat down during the day, fierce and hot, but it had not destroyed him. The Lord will keep you from all evil. He will keep your life, not keep him from all difficulty, not prevent all hardship, but keep him from evil. Keep his life. Preserve what was essential, what mattered, what was eternal. The Lord will keep your going out and your coming in from this time forth and forevermore. This was not just about this journey. This was about every journey, every leaving and every returning, every beginning and every ending, from this time forth, now, today, this moment, and forevermore, forever, without end, eternal keeping, eternal watching, eternal love. The truth of it crashed over him like a wave, and he found himself on his knees, forehead pressed to the stone floor of the temple, his whole body shaking with the force of the revelation. He was loved, he was seen, he was kept. Not because he was special or righteous or deserving, but simply because he existed. Because the God who had made the hills and the stars and the vast expanse of sea and sky had also made him, Matthias, a young shepherd from a small village, and had numbered every hair on his head, knew every thought in his mind, saw every step he took. The psalm was not just poetry. It was not just beautiful words meant to comfort. It was truth, solid and reliable as stone, true as the rising of the sun. He did not know how long he stayed there, kneeling on the floor while pilgrims flowed around him like water around a stone. Time seemed to stretch and compress simultaneously. It could have been minutes or hours, but when he finally raised his head, the light had changed. The sun had set, and torches were being lit around the court, their flames pushing back the darkness. Matthias rose slowly, his knees stiff, his face wet with tears. He felt different, not in any way he could easily name, but it was there nonetheless, a settledness, a peace, a knowing. He made his way out of the temple complex as the evening prayers were concluding, moving through the crowds with a strange new awareness. He saw the beggars by the gate with different eyes now, seeing in them not obstacles or nuisances, but fellow souls, each with their own story, each known and loved by the same God who knew and loved him. He pressed coins into several outstretched hands, not out of duty, but out of overflow. Finding lodging was easier than he had expected. A family with a small house near the Siloam pool had room in their courtyard for travelers, and the woman of the house welcomed him with the practiced ease of one who had hosted many pilgrims. She gave him bread and lentil stew, showed him where he could wash, and pointed to a corner where he could spread his cloak and sleep. That night, lying under the stars with the sounds of Jerusalem all around him, voices raised in prayer from nearby houses, the distant bleating of sheep, the murmur of other pilgrims settling in for the night, Matthias felt a contentment so deep it was almost painful in its intensity. He had found what he was seeking Or rather, as the old woman at the well had said, what he was seeking had found him. The Apocalypse, chapter 2, Days of Integration. The next days passed in a rhythm that felt both ancient and new. Matthias rose early each morning, joined the first prayers at the temple, spent his days walking the streets of Jerusalem, listening, watching, learning. He did not hurry. There was no need to rush. Each moment contained its own teaching. Each encounter held its own gift. He watched a potter at work one morning, shaping clay on a wheel that spun beneath his practiced hands. The man's fingers pressed and pulled, formed and reformed, until the shapeless lump became a vessel, beautiful and functional. Matthias thought of the prophet Jeremiah, of the lesson about God as potter and Israel as clay, and understood it in a new way. He too was being shaped, molded, formed into something he had not been before. He sat in a synagogue one afternoon and listened to a teacher expound on the Torah, his words weaving together scripture and commentary, history and hope. The students asked questions, debated interpretations, pushed back against easy answers. And Matthias saw that faith was not about blind acceptance, but about wrestling, questioning, seeking. The God who had created minds capable of wonder and doubt was not afraid of questions. He encountered a blind beggar sitting by the pool of Siloam, his cup held out, his voice calling out blessings on those who passed. Matthias stopped and sat beside him, and they talked for over an hour. The man's name was Hosea, and he had been blind from birth. But when he spoke about God, his face shone with a light that came from somewhere deeper than physical sight. "People pity me," Hosea said, his sightless eyes turned toward the sound of Matthias's voice. "They think I am cursed, that my blindness is punishment for sin. But I tell you truly, I see things they cannot. I see the faithfulness of God in the kindness of strangers who share their bread. I see the beauty of creation in the warmth of the sun on my face. I see the presence of the divine in the laughter of children playing. My eyes do not work, but my soul sees clearly." Matthias pressed several coins into the man's hand, far more than he could really afford to give, and Hosea gripped his wrist. "You are troubled, young one. Not greatly, but I hear it in your voice. What weighs on you?" "How did you know?" Matthias asked, startled. "When you cannot see with eyes, you learn to see with ears and heart," Hosea said simply. "Tell me." And Matthias found himself speaking about the encounter with Levi on the road, about how helping the injured man had felt right and necessary, but also how it had frightened him, how he had almost walked past like the others. Hosea listened in silence, his head tilted slightly as if to catch every nuance of tone. When Matthias finished, the old beggar nodded slowly. "Do you know what I hear in your story?" Hosea said. "I hear the psalm, the 121st, yes?" Matthias felt a chill run down his spine. "How did you—" "Because it is the psalm of pilgrims, of all who walk uncertain roads," Hosea interrupted gently. "And you are living it, young friend. You lifted your eyes to the hills and asked where your help would come from. The answer came, from the Lord. And then, when you encountered one who needed help, you became the answer to his prayer. Do you see? We are kept so that we might keep others. We are watched over so that we might watch over one another. This is how God works, through hands and feet and hearts that are willing to stop, to see, to act." The insight struck Matthias with the force of revelation. He had been thinking of the psalm as a promise of protection for himself, and it was that. But it was also a call to be part of that protection for others. The keeper worked through keeping. The watcher worked through watching. The love that had held him was a love meant to flow through him to others. "Thank you," Matthias said, his voice thick with emotion. "No thanks needed," Hosea replied. "We are all walking each other home." That night, Matthias attended prayers at the temple again, and when the Levites sang the Psalms of Ascent, he listened with new ears. Each psalm was a step, a stage of journey, a lesson learned. Some spoke of distress and crying out to God. Others spoke of trust and confidence. Some acknowledged enemies and troubles. Others celebrated deliverance and joy. Together, they told the story of pilgrimage, not just the physical journey to Jerusalem, but the interior journey every soul makes toward God. On his fourth day in Jerusalem, Matthias encountered Simeon again, the old man who had first spoken the psalm to him by the spring. The meeting was pure chance, or perhaps not chance at all. Matthias was walking through the market, looking at the wares displayed on tables and carpets, when he heard a familiar voice. Matthias, young Matthias from Beth-Zur. He turned and saw Simeon emerging from the crowd, his face creased in a broad smile, his white beard catching the afternoon light. "You made it," Simeon said, gripping both of Matthias's shoulders in the embrace of reunion. "I knew you would, but it gladdens my heart to see you here, whole and well." They found a quiet corner and sat together, sharing the bread and dried figs Matthias had purchased. He told Simeon about his journey, about Daniel by the spring, and Levi on the road, and Hosea by the pool. He spoke of the moment in the temple when the psalm had become more than words, when he had understood in his bones what it meant to be kept. Simeon listened with the attention of one who understands the value of stories, nodding at certain points, his eyes growing moist at others. When Matthias finished, the old man sat in silence for a long moment, his gaze distant. "Do you know how many times I have made this journey?" Simeon finally asked. "You said you have come every year since you were young," Matthias replied. 63 times, Simeon said. 63 pilgrimages from Tekoa to Jerusalem. And every single time I learned something new. Every time the psalm reveals another layer of meaning. This year, sitting here with you, I am learning that one of the ways God keeps us is by putting us in the path of those who need to hear that they are kept. He reached out and tapped Matthias's chest gently. "You carry the psalm now, not just in your memory, but in your heart. You have lived it, and because you have lived it, you can share it truly." "I am only 17, Matthias protested. "What do I have to teach? Age and wisdom are not always companions," Simeon said with a gentle smile. "Sometimes the youngest among us see most clearly because they have not yet learned to stop looking. You have eyes that see, Matthias, and a heart that feels. Do not diminish what God has given you." They parted with blessings, and Matthias walked through Jerusalem with Simeon's words echoing in his mind. He thought of his father, of the way Joash had blessed him before he left. He thought of his mother's tears and his sister's gift of twisted wool still tied around its wrist. He thought of his village, small and simple and far from the grandeur of Jerusalem, and he felt a sudden fierce love for it. This city was holy, yes. It was the center of faith, the dwelling place of God's name. But home was also holy. The hills around Beth-Zur were also held in the palm of the Creator. The sheep he tended were also numbered and known. The well where women gathered, the synagogue where men prayed, the houses where families broke bread, all of it was sacred, because all of it existed under the watchful gaze of the keeper who neither slumbered nor slept. On his final full day in Jerusalem, Matthias rose before dawn and made his way to the temple one last time. The city was still mostly asleep, just beginning to stir. The air was cool and fresh, carrying the scent of bread baking in clay ovens. The stars were fading, but a few still shone, and he remembered lying in the wilderness and feeling overwhelmed by their multitude. The temple courts were quieter at this hour, though never truly empty. There were priests preparing for the morning sacrifice, pilgrims who had kept vigil through the night, Levites practicing the psalms they would sing. Matthias found a place near the wall and watched as the sky slowly lightened, gray giving way to pink, pink to gold. And then the sun broke over the eastern hills, flooding the temple with light, and the morning sacrifice was offered. The smoke rose straight up in the still air, and the Levites sang, their voices clear and strong in the morning quiet. Matthias closed his eyes and spoke the psalm, not from memory, but from experience. Each word weighted with meaning. I will lift up my eyes to the hills. From where does my help come? He had lifted his eyes. He had asked the question. My help comes from the Lord, who made heaven and earth. And he had received the answer not once but many times in many ways. He will not let your foot be moved. He who keeps you will not slumber. His feet had been kept steady, even when the path was rough. Behold, he who keeps Israel will neither slumber nor sleep. Through every dark night, through every uncertain moment, he had been watched over. The Lord is your keeper. The Lord is your shade on your right hand. Protection and presence, always at his right hand. The place of honor and nearness. The sun shall not strike you by day, nor the moon by night. He had walked through heat and darkness and emerged whole. The Lord will keep you from all evil. He will keep your life, not from all difficulty, but from evil. His life, his essential self, had been preserved. The Lord will keep your going out and your coming in from this time forth and forevermore. This was the promise that would carry him forward. Every leaving and every returning, every journey and every homecoming, all held in eternal keeping. He opened his eyes, and the world seemed brighter, more vivid. The stones of the temple glowed in the morning light. The faces of the pilgrims around him were beautiful in their diversity, each one a story, each one beloved. The sound of prayer and song filled the air like incense rising toward heaven. Matthias knew it was time to go home. Part 4. The Return. Chapter 1. The Road Home. The journey back to Beth-Zur began at midday, after Matthias had said goodbye to the family who had hosted him and made one final circuit through the temple courts. He left Jerusalem through the same gate he had entered, but everything looked different now. The streets that had seemed overwhelming on arrival now felt familiar. The crowds that had felt intimidating now felt like a river he could navigate. He joined a group of pilgrims heading south, families returning to the villages of Judea, their festival obligations fulfilled, their hearts full. There was singing as they walked, the songs of pilgrimage that celebrated the journey and the destination, that gave thanks for safe passage and divine protection. Matthias sang with them, his voice stronger now, more confident, and he noticed that the road itself seemed different. The hills that had appeared so ominous on the journey to Jerusalem now seemed like old friends. He recognized landmarks, the terebinth tree where he had rested, the spring where he had met Daniel, the narrow defile where he had found Levi. On the second day of his return journey, as he was walking alone during the hottest part of the afternoon, he encountered a small family struggling with a loaded donkey. The animal had gone lame, and they were trying to redistribute the weight while their young children sat in the meager shade of a boulder. Matthias stopped without hesitation. "Can I help?" The father, a man perhaps 10 years older than Matthias, with the calloused hands of a farmer, looked up with a mixture of relief and suspicion. "We can manage," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "I know donkeys," Matthias said simply. "I am a shepherd. Let me look at the hoof." He knelt beside the animal and examined its right foreleg. A stone had lodged in the hoof, causing pain and lameness. Matthias used his knife to carefully pry it out, then spoke soothingly to the donkey as he checked for further injury. Finding none, he stood and smiled at the father. He should be fine now. Just walk slowly for the rest of today. The man's wife had come forward, a baby in her arms, gratitude shining in her eyes. "Thank you, friend. We have little to offer in return, but please share our meal tonight." Matthias agreed, and that evening he sat with the family by their small fire, eating simple food and listening to their story. They were from a village south of Hebron, and this had been their first pilgrimage as a family. The husband spoke of the wonder of seeing the temple through his children's eyes, of teaching them the prayers his father had taught him. "My eldest," he said, gesturing to a boy of perhaps 7 years. "He asked me why God needs a temple if he is everywhere, and I realized I had never really thought about it." He paused, staring into the fire. "I told him that God does not need the temple, but we do. We need a place to go where we remember who we are, where we came from, whose we are." The words struck Matthias as profound. That was it exactly. The journey to Jerusalem, the time in the temple, it had not changed God. It had changed him. It had reminded him of truths that had always been true, but that he had needed to experience to truly understand. He played with the children before they slept, teaching them a simple game his sister Ruth had taught him, and their laughter was like music in the cooling evening air. When they finally settled down, curled against their mother, their eyes heavy with sleep, Matthias felt a contentment that surprised him in its depth. That night, as he lay wrapped in his cloak under the vast canopy of stars, he understood something fundamental. The keeping he had experienced was not passive. It was active, dynamic, flowing through him to others. He had been kept so that he might keep. He had been watched over so that he might watch over. The love that had held him on his journey was now asking to be given away. He thought of the psalm again, but this time with new understanding. The Lord will keep your going out and your coming in. Not just his own going out and coming in, but the going out and coming in of this family, of the injured man Levi, of old Simeon, of Daniel by the spring, of everyone he had encountered. They were all held in the same eternal watchfulness. The stars wheeled slowly overhead, ancient and constant, and Matthias drifted into sleep with a prayer of gratitude on his lips. The third day of his return journey brought him within sight of Beth-Zur. The hills he had known since childhood rose before him, no longer obstacles, but old friends. He could see the terraced slopes where his family's olive trees grew, the path he had walked countless times with the sheep, the well where his mother drew water each morning. As he approached the village, he saw a small figure running toward him down the path. It was Ruth, his sister, her hair flying behind her, her face alight with joy. Behind her came his parents, moving more slowly, but with equal gladness in their faces. Ruth reached him first, throwing her arms around his waist and burying her face against his chest. "You came back! You came back! Did you think I would not?" he asked, laughing, his hand gentle on her head. "I prayed every day," she said, looking up at him with eyes shining with tears. "I sang the psalm Abba taught me, the one about the hills." Matthias felt his throat tighten. Of course, the psalm had been with him not only on the road, but here at home, held by those who loved him, spoken on his behalf, a web of prayer and protection woven by faith and love. His mother reached them, and she took his face in her hands as she had done before he left, studying him with a mother's knowing eyes. "You are changed," she said softly. "I see it in you." "Yes, Ima," he said simply. "I am changed." His father stood back slightly, but his eyes were bright with unshed tears. When Matthias turned to him, Joash opened his arms, and they embraced as men, no longer father and boy, but father and man, who had both walked the pilgrim road and understood what it meant. "Welcome home, my son," Joash said, his voice rough with emotion. "Welcome home." They walked together back to the village, and it seemed to Matthias that everything was exactly as he had left it, and yet completely different. The houses were the same, the streets unchanged, the faces familiar. But he saw it all with new eyes, eyes that had seen the temple and walked through the valley of shadow and emerged into light. The neighbors gathered as word spread of his return, asking questions about Jerusalem, wanting to hear about the temple, the crowds, the festival. Matthias answered patiently, describing what he had seen, but he found himself speaking more about the people he had met than about the buildings, more about the moments of revelation than about the spectacle. Old Eli, who had given him the wooden token before he left, shuffled forward and took both of Matthias's hands in his gnarled ones. "You understand now," he said, and it was not a question. "The words I spoke to you, you understand them now." "Yes, grandfather," Matthias said, using the term of respect for elders. "I understand. The Lord is my keeper. He does not slumber nor sleep, and I have been kept." Eli smiled, his weathered face creasing into 1,000 lines of joy. "And so the wisdom passes from generation to generation, as I learned it, as you have learned it, as you will teach it to your children and your children's children. This is how faith survives, not in buildings of stone, but in hearts transformed." That evening, after the communal meal and the questions had subsided, Matthias sat with his family around their own fire. His mother had prepared his favorite dishes, and they ate slowly, savoring both the food and the togetherness. Ruth sat pressed against his side as if afraid he might disappear again, and he kept his arm around her, drawing comfort from her warmth. "Tell us truly," his father said when the meal was finished and the lamps were burning low, "what did you find in Jerusalem?" Matthias was quiet for a long moment, gathering his thoughts. How could he compress all that he had experienced into words? How could he make them understand the vastness of what he had learned? "I found," he said slowly, "that the psalm you sang to me before I left was not just words of comfort. It was truth, lived and breathed and tested. I found that every step of my journey was watched over, that I was never alone, even when I felt most isolated. I found that the God who made the hills and the stars and the vast expanse of the world is the same God who knows me, Matthias, who sees me, who cares about my every step." He paused, his voice growing stronger. "I found that faith is not about the absence of fear, but about trusting in the midst of fear. I found that the keeping we receive is meant to flow through us to others. I found that every person I meet is beloved, precious, held in the same divine care that holds me." His mother wiped tears from her eyes. "You have found wisdom, my son, true wisdom that comes not from study alone, but from living. And you have found your answer," his father added. "You wanted to know if God was real, if the faith we taught you was more than tradition. And now you know." "Now I know," Matthias agreed. "Not because someone told me, but because I have experienced it. The psalm is not poetry, it is reality. The Lord is my keeper. He has proven it in 1,000 ways. Ruth stirred against his side. Will you teach me, Matthias? Will you teach me about the psalm and about Jerusalem and about everything you learned? He smiled and kissed the top of her head. Yes, little one, I will teach you. And perhaps one day, when you are older, you will make your own pilgrimage, and you will learn the lessons that only the road can teach. But I'm afraid, she whispered. The world is so big, and I am so small. I know, he said gently. I was afraid too. But fear and faith can live together. The important thing is that we do not let fear stop us from the journey we are meant to make. And we remember always that we are watched over. The keeper does not sleep. Chapter 2. Integration into daily life. The days that followed Matthias's return found him settling back into the rhythms of village life, but with a new consciousness that transformed even the most mundane tasks. Rising before dawn to lead the sheep to pasture, he found himself singing the songs of ascent, his voice joining with the bird song in a hymn of praise. The hills that had once been simply familiar terrain now seemed to glow with divine presence, each stone and tree a testament to the Creator's care. His work as a shepherd, which he had sometimes found tedious, now felt like a sacred calling. As he watched over the flock, guiding them to green pastures and still waters, he understood in a visceral way the metaphor that had been used for centuries. He was like these sheep, dependent, vulnerable, in need of constant watching. And just as he did not sleep when the flock was threatened, just as he counted them morning and evening to ensure none was lost, so too did the Good Shepherd watch over him. One morning, about a week after his return, he encountered a young ram that had wandered from the flock and become entangled in thorns. The animal was bleeding, frightened, struggling against the very brambles that held it captive. Matthias approached slowly, speaking in soothing tones, and carefully freed the ram, his own hand scratched and bleeding from the thorns. As he tended the animal's wounds, applying oil to the cuts and checking for deeper injuries, he thought of his own journey. How many times had he been like this ram, caught in tangles of his own making, struggling until someone wiser and stronger came to free him? How many times had he been anointed with the oil of comfort and healing, carried when he could not walk, restored when he was depleted? The ram, once freed and tended, stood close to Matthias for the rest of the day, as if recognizing in him a savior. And Matthias understood that this was how he should remain toward God, not independent and distant, but close, trusting, grateful. He began to share his experiences with others in the village, though not in ways that drew attention to himself. When younger shepherds complained about the difficulty of their work, he would speak of the privilege of keeping watch, of being trusted with lives. When families struggled with fear about the future, he would quietly recite portions of the psalm, letting the words do their own work in hearts prepared to receive them. The village rabbi, a learned man named Eleazar, who had known Matthias since birth, invited him to share his testimony at the synagogue on Shabbat. It was not common for one so young to address the congregation, but there was a growing recognition that Matthias had undergone a transformation that merited attention. On that Shabbat, as the sun began its descent, and the community gathered in the simple stone building that served as their house of prayer, Matthias stood before his neighbors with a mixture of nervousness and peace. He had not prepared elaborate words. He simply told his story. He spoke of leaving Beth-Zur with fear in his heart, of encountering strangers who became teachers, of walking through valleys of shadow and emerging into light. He spoke of the injured man Levi, of helping when others had passed by, of understanding that being kept meant keeping others. He spoke of the moment in the temple when the psalm had ceased to be words and had become lived reality. "I went to Jerusalem," he concluded, his voice steady and clear, seeking to know if God was real. "And I returned knowing not just that He is real, but that He is close, closer than breath, more constant than the rising sun, more faithful than we can imagine." The psalm that many of you have sung all your lives, it is true. Every word is true. And I have been kept, am being kept, and will be kept from this time forth and forevermore. When he finished, there was a profound silence in the synagogue, and then, slowly, voices began to join in song, singing the 121st Psalm, the words rising and falling like waves on a shore, ancient and new, all at once. After the service, many approached Matthias. Some had tears in their eyes, others had questions. Still others simply wanted to touch his shoulder or shake his hand, as if some of the blessing he had received might transfer to them. An elderly widow named Deborah, whose husband had died the previous winter, gripped his hand with surprising strength. "I have been angry," she said, her voice trembling, "angry that God took my beloved, angry that I am left alone in my old age. But hearing you speak, I remember now, I am not alone. I am kept. Even in my grief, even in my loss, I am watched over." "Yes, grandmother," Matthias said gently, "you are watched over. The keeper does not sleep, and he sees your tears, and he holds your sorrow. You are not forgotten." She wept then, but they were tears of release rather than bitterness. And when she left, her back seemed a little straighter, her step a little lighter. A young couple expecting their first child stopped him as well. "We are afraid," the husband admitted. "My wife's sister died in childbirth last year. Every day we fear what might come." Matthias looked at them with compassion, remembering his own fear on the road. "Fear is natural," he said, "but it need not rule you. You can be afraid and still trust. You can acknowledge the danger and still believe in the keeper. Lift up your eyes to the hills. Ask where your help comes from. And when the answer comes, that your help is from the Lord who made heaven and earth, hold on to that truth. Hold on to it when the labor begins, when the pain comes, when uncertainty threatens to overwhelm you. You are kept. Your wife is kept. Your child is kept." The woman touched her swollen belly, her eyes filling with tears. "Will you pray for us? When the time comes, I will pray for you every day," Matthias promised, "and I will ask others to pray as well. You will not face this alone." Chapter 3. The Deepening. As weeks turned into months, Matthias found that his experience in Jerusalem was not a destination, but a beginning. The transformation he had undergone was not complete, but ongoing, unfolding in layers like a flower, opening to the sun. He began to notice things he had never seen before, though they had always been there. The way dawn light touched the hills, painting them in shades of rose and gold, seemed to him now like a daily reminder of divine faithfulness. The pattern of stars overhead, unchanging from night to night, spoke of constancy and order in a world that often felt chaotic. The cycle of seasons, planting and harvest, wet and dry, cold and warm, testified to a rhythm established by the same Creator who had established rhythms in his own soul. He developed a practice of rising even earlier than before, while the village still slept, to spend time in prayer and contemplation. He would climb to the roof of his father's house as he had done before his journey, and there, in the pre-dawn darkness, he would recite the psalms he had learned, letting the words shape his heart and mind for the day ahead. One morning, as he sat in this way, his father joined him. They sat in silence for a long time, watching the darkness slowly give way to light. And then Joash spoke. "I see changes in you," he said. "Not just the obvious ones, the confidence, the peace, but deeper things. You carry yourself differently. You relate to others differently. Even the way you care for the sheep has changed." "How so?" Matthias asked, curious about what his father had observed. "You are more present," Joash said thoughtfully. "Before, you were often restless, your mind elsewhere, wanting to be anywhere but here. Now, you are fully where you are. When you are with the sheep, you are truly with them. When you speak to someone, you are truly listening. You have learned to inhabit your life rather than merely endure it." The observation struck Matthias as profoundly true. He had learned through his journey that every moment was sacred, every place was holy, every person was precious. There was no need to be elsewhere because God was fully present here, now, in this moment. "The journey taught me," Matthias said slowly, "that I was seeking something I already had. I went to Jerusalem to find God, but God was with me every step of the way. He was in Beth-Zur before I left, on the road as I traveled, in the temple when I arrived, and here again now that I have returned. The geography changed, but the presence did not." "That is wisdom," his father said. "Hard-won wisdom. Most people spend their whole lives seeking elsewhere what is already present. You have learned young what some never learn at all." They sat together as the sun broke over the horizon, and Matthias felt a deep gratitude for this man who had given him life, who had blessed him to go, and who welcomed him back, transformed. The harvest season came, and with it the hard work of gathering barley and wheat. Matthias worked alongside his father and the other men of the village, the labor long and exhausting under the hot sun. But even in this, he found joy. The rhythm of the sickle cutting grain, the feel of the stalks in his hands, the smell of earth and chaff, all of it seemed to him like participation in the divine creative act. During the harvest, he had occasion to work alongside Tobias, the young man he had met briefly on his pilgrimage. Tobias had also returned to his village and was helping his family bring in their crops. They worked side by side for several days, and in their conversations, Matthias learned that Tobias's perspective on the pilgrimage had been transformed as well. "I went because my father insisted," Tobias admitted, as they took a break in the shade of an olive tree sharing bread and water. "I had made the journey twice before and thought there was nothing new to experience. But this time, I met a young man who was making his first pilgrimage, and his wonder reminded me of what I had lost. I saw Jerusalem through his eyes and remembered why we go." "What did you remember?" Matthias asked. "That it is not about the destination, but about what happens in us along the way. That the journey strips away our pretenses and shows us who we really are. That we go seeking God and discover He has been seeking us all along." Tobias paused, his eyes distant. "I returned home and looked at my life, at the way I had been living without really living, going through motions without meaning, and I decided to change, to be more present, more grateful, more aware." Matthias smiled. "So we both returned transformed, just in different ways." "Yes," Tobias agreed, "and I think that is how it is meant to be. The same journey, the same destination, but each person encounters what they need to encounter, learns what they need to learn. During the Festival of Tabernacles that year, the entire village constructed temporary shelters, booths made of branches and leaves, where families would live for 7 days, commemorating the wilderness wandering of their ancestors. Matthias helped his family build their booth, and as he did, he thought of his nights sleeping under the stars on his pilgrimage, of the temporary nature of all earthly dwelling places, of the truth that they were all sojourners seeking a permanent home. On the first night in the booth, as his family gathered for the evening meal, Ruth asked him to tell them more about his journey. She had heard the basic story but wanted details. What had he eaten? Where had he slept? What had frightened him most? What had made him laugh? Matthias told her about the dried figs his mother had packed, about sleeping by the spring with Daniel, about the moment of terror when he thought he was lost in the darkness, about the children he had played with at the caravanserai. He made the story come alive for her, and she listened with wide eyes, asking questions, imagining herself on such a journey. "Will you take me some day?" she asked. "When I am old enough, will you show me Jerusalem?" "If God wills it and our parents permit it, yes," Matthias said. "But remember, little one, the most important journey is not the one to Jerusalem, but the one in your own heart. You can make that journey right here in Beth-Zur." "How?" she asked, puzzled. "By lifting your eyes to the hills every day and remembering where your help comes from. By trusting that you are watched over, even when you cannot see the watcher. By living each day with gratitude and awareness that every moment is a gift. Jerusalem is holy, yes, but so is this booth, this family, this moment right now." His mother smiled at him from across the small space. "You have become a teacher, my son." "Only because I have been taught," he replied. Chapter 4. The Ripple Effect. As the seasons turned and a year passed since his pilgrimage, Matthias began to see how his transformation had rippled outward, affecting not just himself, but his entire community. Other young people, inspired by his testimony, began to plan their own pilgrimages. Parents who had been reluctant to let their children go were now encouraged by Matthias's safe return and evident growth. A group of 5 young men from Beth-Zur and neighboring villages asked Matthias to advise them as they prepared for their journey. He met with them several times, sharing practical wisdom about what to bring, which routes to take, where to find shelter. But more importantly, he shared spiritual wisdom about what to expect, how to remain open to encounters and lessons, how to let the journey work on their hearts. "Do not rush," he told them. "The temptation will be to move quickly, to reach Jerusalem as fast as possible. But the journey itself is as important as the destination. Pay attention, notice things, speak to strangers, be willing to be uncomfortable, to be uncertain, to be changed." "What if we're afraid?" one of the young men asked. "You will be afraid," Matthias said with certainty. "Fear is part of the journey. But remember the psalm, 'He who keeps you will not slumber. You are watched over every step of the way.' The fear is real, but so is the keeping. Learn to hold both truths together." When the young men departed, Matthias stood at the edge of the village and watched them go, as others had watched him go a year before. He prayed for them, asking the keeper to guard their going out and their coming in, and he felt a deep satisfaction in knowing that he was now part of a chain of blessing, a living tradition being passed from one generation to the next. The young woman, whose pregnancy he had prayed for, gave birth to a healthy son, and when the time came for the naming ceremony, the parents asked Matthias to offer the blessing. It was an honor typically reserved for elders or priests. But they insisted, saying that his words had given them courage during the difficult labor. Matthias held the tiny infant in his arms, marveling at the perfect smallness of him, the delicate fingers, and the wisp of dark hair. He thought of the psalm, of the keeping that extended to this new life, and he spoke over the child. May the Lord bless you and keep you. May he make his face shine upon you and be gracious to you. May he lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace. May you grow in wisdom and stature, in favor with God and with people. May you learn early that you are watched over by the one who never sleeps, whose care extends from the moment of your birth to the end of your days and beyond. May you lift up your eyes to the hills and know where your help comes from. The parents wept, and those gathered murmured, Amen. And the child, named Josiah, meaning the Lord supports, slept peacefully through it all, a tiny embodiment of trust and surrender. Matthias also found himself sought out by those experiencing grief or hardship, perhaps because he had walked through the valley of shadow and emerged whole. People sensed that he could understand their pain without minimizing it, could offer hope without false promises. Old Deborah, the widow who had spoken to him after his testimony at the synagogue, became a particular friend. He would visit her often, helping with tasks that had become difficult for her aging body, drawing water from the well, repairing a broken door, harvesting olives from her trees, and in return, she would share with him the wisdom of her many years, stories of faith tested and proven, of loss endured and meaning found. People think that faith grows stronger only through pleasant experiences. She told him one afternoon as they sat shelling beans together. But that is not true. Faith grows strongest in the dark places, when we have nothing to hold on to except the promises of God. When my husband died, I felt as if I had fallen into a pit with no light, no way out. But even in that pit, even when I could see nothing, I was held. The keeper did not let me fall all the way to destruction. And slowly, very slowly, I felt myself being lifted, not out of the grief that remains even now, but through it. There is a difference. Tell me about the difference, Matthias said, genuinely curious. Being lifted out would mean the grief was removed, that I no longer miss my beloved, that the pain is gone. But that is not what happened. The grief remains, but it has been transformed. It is no longer a pit that traps me, but a valley I walk through. The pain is still there, but it has become a teacher rather than a tormentor. And through it all, I am accompanied. I am not alone in my sorrow. The keeper walks with me, and somehow that makes all the difference. Matthias absorbed her words, storing them away as precious treasure. He understood that she was teaching him about a deeper level of the psalm, an application he had not yet needed, but might someday require. The keeping was not just for pleasant journeys, but for dark valleys, not just for youth, but for old age, not just for joy, but for sorrow. Parfois, the full circle. Chapter 1. Years later. 3 years had passed since Matthias's first pilgrimage to Jerusalem, and in that time he had made the journey twice more. Each journey had deepened his understanding, revealed new layers of meaning in the psalm that had become so central to his life. But the pilgrimages were no longer the defining feature of his spiritual life. They were instead confirmations of what had become constant, the awareness of being watched over, of walking in the presence of the divine, of being kept in ways both visible and invisible. Matthias was now 20 years old, and his father had begun to speak of finding him a wife, of establishing him with his own household and flock. The conversations made Matthias thoughtful, but not anxious. He trusted that the same keeper who had guided his steps to Jerusalem and back would also guide him in this new chapter. There was a young woman in a neighboring village named Miriam, daughter of a potter, whom Matthias had met during one of the festivals. She had a quiet strength about her, a deep faith that required no ostentation, and eyes that saw beyond surfaces to the heart of things. They had spoken several times, always under the watchful eyes of family, and Matthias found himself drawn to her gentleness and wisdom. After proper consultations between families, after the exchange of gifts and negotiations of bride price, a betrothal was arranged. Matthias and Miriam would be married after the next harvest, beginning a new chapter in both their lives. During the betrothal period, as was customary, Matthias saw Miriam only occasionally and always in the presence of others. But they were able to speak, to learn about each other's hopes and dreams, to begin weaving the connections that would bind them together. One evening, as they walked together through Miriam's village with her mother trailing at a respectful distance, Miriam asked him about his pilgrimage to Jerusalem. She had heard the basic story from others, but wanted to hear it from him directly. Matthias told her, speaking of the fear and wonder, the encounters and revelations, the moment in the temple when everything had crystallized into understanding. He spoke of the psalm, reciting it in full, explaining how it had become the framework for his entire life. Miriam listened with complete attention, and when he finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "I have not been to Jerusalem. My family is poor, and the journey is expensive. But I think I understand what you learned, because I have learned something similar here in my father's workshop." "Tell me," Matthias said, genuinely interested. "My father is a potter," she began, "and I have watched him work since I was a small child. He takes clay, shapeless, formless, just a lump of mud, and he places it on the wheel. And as the wheel spins, he presses and pulls, forms and shapes. Sometimes the clay resists, and he must add water or start over or work more slowly. But always he has a vision in his mind of what the clay will become. A jar for water, a bowl for grain, a lamp for oil. And he does not stop working until the clay has taken the shape he intended." She paused, and Matthias saw where she was going. "I am that clay," she continued softly, "shapeless, imperfect, full of flaws. But the potter, the divine potter, has a vision for what I am meant to become, and he works patiently, constantly, never sleeping, never giving up on me. When I resist, he adds water, tears perhaps, or difficulties that soften my hardness. When I begin to collapse, he supports me with his hands, and all the while he is shaping me into something useful, something beautiful, something that can hold his light and his love." Matthias stopped walking, moved by the profundity of her insight. "That is it exactly," he said. "That is what the keeping means. Not just protection from external harm, but the active shaping of who we are meant to become. The keeper is also the creator, the potter, the one who never stops working on us." Miriam smiled, a shy but genuine expression of joy. "Then we understand each other. We have both learned in different ways about the faithfulness of God, and perhaps that understanding will help us build a home together that honors Him." "Yes," Matthias agreed, his heart full. "Yes, I believe it will." Chapter 2. The Wedding and New Beginning. The wedding took place on a bright autumn day, when the heat of summer had passed, but the chill of winter had not yet arrived. The ceremony was held in Miriam's village, as was customary, and it seemed that everyone from both Beth-Zur and the surrounding villages had come to celebrate. Matthias wore his best robe, newly washed and mended, with a blue sash that Ruth had woven for him. Miriam was veiled as tradition required, but when the moment came for him to lift the veil and see her face, her eyes were shining with joy, and her smile took his breath away. The rabbi who officiated spoke about the covenant of marriage, comparing it to the covenant between God and his people. He spoke about faithfulness, about keeping promises even when circumstances changed, about the importance of watching over one another with the same constancy that the divine keeper watched over them all. You are now, the rabbi concluded, keepers of each other. As you have been kept, so you must keep. As you have been watched over, so you must watch over one another. May your home be a place of peace, of faith, of love that reflects the love of the Almighty. They broke the glass as tradition required, and the community erupted in joyful shouts and song. The celebration that followed lasted well into the night, with music and dancing and feasting. Matthias's father and Miriam's father embraced as family, and the two mothers wept happy tears and planned for future grandchildren. As the stars emerged overhead and the celebration began to wind down, Matthias and Miriam finally had a moment of relative privacy, sitting together at the edge of the gathering, watching the dancers. "Are you happy?" Matthias asked quietly. "More than I knew I could be," Miriam replied, her hand finding his. "And you?" "The same," he said. "It feels like the completion of a journey I did not know I was taking. Like all the roads have led to this moment, to you, to this new beginning." "Not an ending, then?" she asked. "No," he said firmly, "never an ending, always a beginning, always another step on the path, always more to learn, more to experience, more to understand about what it means to be kept and to keep." They sat in companionable silence, and Matthias thought about the journey that had brought him here. The frightened boy who had left Beth-Zur 3 years ago seeking proof of God's existence had become a man who no longer needed proof because he had experienced. And that man was now embarking on a new journey, one that would require different kinds of courage and faith, but would be guided by the same faithful keeper. The couple began their life together in a small house that the two families had helped prepare, located between Beth-Zur and Miriam's village. It was simple: 2 rooms, a courtyard, a place for animals, but it was theirs. Matthias continued to shepherd his father's flocks, and Miriam helped her father in the pottery workshop, while also learning the rhythms of managing a household. They established their own rituals and patterns. Each morning, they would rise before dawn and pray together, beginning the day by acknowledging the one who had brought them together and who watched over them. Each evening, before sleep, they would recite the 121st Psalm together, the words becoming a benediction over their home and their lives. Life was not always easy. There were hard days of labor in the sun, lean times when the flock produced less wool than expected, illnesses that required care and patience. But through it all, Matthias and Miriam held to the truth they had both learned. They were kept, not preserved from all difficulty, but held through it, accompanied in it, sustained by a love that was constant and unfailing. The young woman who had given birth to Josiah had him baptized in the faith, and over time came to deeply trust Matthias and Miriam. When little Josiah was old enough to begin learning his letters and the Torah, his parents asked if Matthias would serve as his teacher. It was a role that filled Matthias with both honor and a sense of responsibility. Once a week, Josiah would come to Matthias and Miriam's home, and Matthias would teach him. They would start with the alphabet, then progress to words, then to sentences. But Matthias always incorporated the scriptures into the lessons so that the boy was learning to read while simultaneously learning the stories of his people and the promises of his God. Josiah was bright and curious, full of questions. Why did God create the world? Why did bad things happen to good people? How could they know that God was really watching over them? Matthias answered patiently, drawing on his own journey and experiences. He told Josiah about his pilgrimage, about the fear and the learning, about the psalm that had become his guide. He taught the boy to recite it, and Josiah's young voice, speaking those ancient words, was like music. "Will you take me to Jerusalem someday?" Josiah asked one afternoon, echoing the same request Ruth had made years before. "If your parents permit it, and if God wills it, yes," Matthias said. "But remember, the most important lessons are not learned in Jerusalem alone. They are learned wherever you are, if you have eyes to see and ears to hear." "What should I see?" Josiah asked. "Look for the keeping," Matthias said. "Look for the ways that God watches over you. Notice the food on your table, that is provision. Notice your parents' love, that is protection. Notice the beauty of creation, that is the work of the Creator who made you. Notice how you sleep safely at night, that is because the keeper does not sleep. Train yourself to see these things, and you will find that God is not distant, but very near." Chapter 3, Trials and Deeper Trust. When Matthias was 23 years old, a severe drought came to the region. The rains that should have come in autumn failed to appear. The winter months passed without the usual storms that filled the cisterns and nourished the earth. Spring arrived, but instead of the latter rains that should have brought final moisture before the dry season, there was only relentless sun and dusty wind. The land began to suffer. The barley crop withered in the fields before it could be harvested. The wheat fared little better, producing grain so sparse and shriveled that it was hardly worth the effort of threshing. The olive trees, ancient and resilient, stopped producing fruit. The grapevines that usually gave abundant clusters bore only small, bitter grapes that shriveled on the branch. Matthias's flocks began to suffer as well. The pastures turned brown, then gray, then to dust. He had to lead the sheep farther and farther each day to find grazing, often walking for hours to reach valleys where a bit of green remained. Water sources that had flowed for generations began to dry up. Wells that had never failed now gave only muddy dregs. The entire region felt the grip of the drought. In Beth-Zur and the surrounding villages, families began to make difficult decisions. Some sold livestock they could no longer feed. Others left to seek work in regions less affected. The weekly markets grew sparse, with fewer goods to trade and less money to trade with. The mood of the community shifted from hopeful waiting to anxious concern to grim endurance. Matthias and Miriam felt the pressure acutely. They were still newly married, their household not yet fully established, without the reserves that older families had accumulated over years of plenty. Their small flock dwindled as weak sheep died, despite Matthias's best efforts to keep them alive. The garden that Miriam tended so carefully produced almost nothing. The storage jars that should have been full of grain and oil were dangerously low. One evening, after a particularly difficult day in which Matthias had walked from dawn to dusk seeking pasture and found almost nothing, he returned home exhausted and discouraged. Miriam met him at the door, and he could see in her face that she too was struggling. They sat together in the courtyard as the sun set, and for a long time neither spoke. Finally, Miriam broke the silence. "I am afraid," she said simply. "I have tried not to be. I have prayed. I have remembered all that you taught me about being kept and watched over. But I am afraid. What if the rains never come? What if we lose everything?" Matthias took her hand, and he felt the calluses that had formed from her work, the roughness that spoke of labor and care. "I am afraid, too," he admitted, "and I have been asking myself the same questions you are asking. Where is the keeper now? Where is the watchfulness, the provision, the care? How can we be kept if we are losing everything?" "And what answer have you found?" Miriam asked quietly. "I am not sure I have found an answer," Matthias said slowly, "but I have found a remembering. I remember my journey to Jerusalem, when I walked through the valley of shadow and felt abandoned. And I remember that even in that valley, even when I could see no path forward, I was held, not rescued from the difficulty, but held within it." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "The psalm does not promise that the sun will never strike us, only that we will not be struck down by it. It does not promise that we will never walk through hard places, only that we will not walk through them alone. And I am beginning to understand that being kept does not mean being protected from all hardship. It means being sustained through it." Miriam was quiet, absorbing his words. Then she said, "My father told me once about a time of drought when he was young. He said it was the potter's clay that taught him about faith in that season. Do you know what happens to clay in a drought? It becomes hard, I suppose, difficult to work with." "Yes," Miriam said, "but my father said that the master potters, the ones who truly understood their craft, knew that clay worked in drought has a different quality. It is denser, stronger. A vessel made from drought clay, if the potter has the skill to shape it, will last longer and hold water better than one made from clay taken in the rainy season. The drought makes it more valuable, not less, but only if the potter does not give up on it." Matthias felt tears prick his eyes. "We are the clay," he said. "We are the clay," Miriam confirmed, "and the drought is shaping us, not destroying us, though it feels that way, shaping us into vessels that can hold more, that can last longer, that can serve better. But we must trust the potter. We must not let ourselves crack and crumble in his hands." They sat together as darkness fell, and Matthias found himself reciting the psalm, his voice soft but steady in the night air. "I will lift up my eyes to the hills. From where does my help come? My help comes from the Lord, who made heaven and earth." He paused, and Miriam joined her voice to his. "He will not let your foot be moved. He who keeps you will not slumber. Behold, he who keeps Israel will neither slumber nor sleep." They continued together, each line a declaration of faith that felt like defiance against the evidence of their circumstances, and yet also like surrender to something larger than circumstances. "The Lord is your keeper. The Lord is your shade on your right hand. The sun shall not strike you by day, nor the moon by night." As they spoke these words, Matthias thought about what they meant in this moment. The sun was indeed striking them, its relentless heat beating down day after day. But they were not struck down. They were still standing, still breathing, still together. The keeping was present even in the drought. "The Lord will keep you from all evil. He will keep your life. The Lord will keep your going out and your coming in from this time forth and forevermore." The words settled into the night air, and Matthias felt something shift inside him. Not a dramatic change, not a sudden relief from their difficulties, but a settledness, a determination. They would endure this. They would trust the potter. They would believe in the keeper, even when they could not see evidence of keeping. The drought continued through the summer and into the following autumn. But Matthias and Miriam found ways to survive. They shared their last stores with neighbors who had even less, and somehow their jars never quite emptied. They traveled to help families in distant villages with their harvest, such as it was, and were paid with grain that saw them through difficult weeks. Matthias found work helping to dig a new well in a neighboring village, and the payment allowed them to purchase supplies. And through it all, they held to the psalm. They recited it together each morning and each evening. They taught it to young Josiah, who came for lessons even in this hard season. His parents determined that their son would learn despite the difficulties. The words became their anchor, their reminder, their hope. One morning, nearly 14 months after the drought had begun, Matthias rose before dawn, as was his custom. He climbed to the roof of their house to pray, and as he looked toward the eastern horizon, he saw something that made his breath catch. Clouds, not the thin, wispy clouds that sometimes appeared and disappeared without bringing relief. These were thick, dark, heavy, with promise. As he watched, they grew and spread, filling the sky, blocking the stars, moving steadily toward Beth-Zur on a wind that smelled of rain. He called for Miriam, his voice urgent with joy, and she came quickly, climbing the ladder to join him on the roof. Together they stood and watched as the clouds covered the heavens, as the first drops began to fall, hesitant at first, then stronger, then in a steady, soaking rain that fell like blessing. All around them they heard voices raised in thanksgiving. Doors opened, and families emerged into the streets, not caring that they were getting wet, lifting their faces to the rain, laughing and weeping simultaneously. Children danced in the puddles that began to form. Old people stood with arms outstretched, receiving the gift of water as if it were the most precious thing in the world, which, in that moment, it was. The rain fell for 3 days and 3 nights, steady and generous. The cisterns filled, the wells refilled. The earth, which had been so hard and unyielding, softened and began to drink deeply. And when the rain finally stopped and the sun emerged, the land seemed to shimmer with gratitude. Within weeks, green shoots appeared in the fields, the olive trees budded, the grapevines sent out new tendrils, the sheep found abundant grazing. Life returned, not slowly, but in a rush, as if the earth had been holding its breath and could finally exhale. But Matthias and Miriam both knew that they had been changed by the drought in ways that would last far longer than the relief. They had learned something about faith that could not have been learned in easier times. They had discovered that the keeping was real even when invisible, that provision could come in unexpected ways, that strength could be found even in weakness. The following spring, Miriam discovered she was with child. The news brought joy that was almost overwhelming. They had hoped for children, had prayed for them, but in the midst of the drought, it had seemed impossible to even think about bringing a child into such difficult circumstances. But now, with the land restored and abundance returning, the gift of new life felt like the perfect completion of a chapter. As Miriam's belly grew through the summer and autumn, Matthias found himself thinking often about the psalm, about what it would mean to teach it to his own child, to pass on the wisdom he had learned through experience. When the time came for Miriam to give birth, it was a cold night in late winter. The labor was long and difficult, and there were moments when Matthias, waiting outside the birthing room with the midwives working inside, felt fear grip his heart. He paced and prayed, reciting the psalm over and over, clinging to the promises that had sustained him through every trial. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, he heard the cry, the thin, fierce wail of a newborn entering the world. And then the midwife emerged, her face tired but joyful, and said, "You have a son. Both mother and child are well." Matthias entered the room to find Miriam exhausted but glowing, cradling a tiny perfect infant in her arms. She looked up at him with tears streaming down her face, and he knelt beside them, his own tears falling freely. "We will call him Nathan," Miriam said softly, "because he is a gift given by the Lord." "Nathan," Matthias repeated, his finger touching the impossibly small hand of his son. "Gift of God." As he held his wife and child, as he felt the weight of this new responsibility and the overwhelming love that came with it, Matthias understood in a new way what it meant to be kept. He was not just being watched over for his own sake. He was being kept so that he could keep others. He was being sustained so that he could sustain. He was being loved so that he could love. The keeping was not passive. It was active, flowing through him to his family, to his community, to the next generation. His son would grow up hearing the psalm, would learn what it meant to lift his eyes to the hills, would discover for himself where help comes from. And Matthias would be there to guide him, to share the wisdom learned through pilgrimage and drought, through valley and mountain, through fear and faith. Chapter 4. The circle widens. The years flowed like water finding its level, each season bringing its own lessons and gifts. Nathan grew from infant to child, his questions endless, his wonder at the world undiminished by familiarity. Matthias taught him the things his own father had taught him: how to care for sheep, how to read the sky for signs of weather, how to find water in dry places, how to live in harmony with the land and the rhythms of creation. But more than practical skills, Matthias taught him the psalm, not as rote memorization, though Nathan learned the words young, but as lived reality. When they walked together through the hills with the flock, Matthias would point to the landscape and say, "See how the valley is dark, but the hills beyond are lit by the sun? That is what it means to lift up your eyes. When you are in the valley, you remember that light exists, that height exists, that help is real even when you cannot see it yet." When Nathan was frightened by a storm, Matthias held him and said, "The keeper does not sleep." Right now, while the thunder crashes and you are afraid, he is watching over us. The storm is loud, but his care is constant. Which is stronger, the noise that passes or the love that remains? When Nathan scraped his knee and came crying, Miriam would wash the wound and say, "This hurts now, but you will heal. Your body knows how to mend itself, because the Creator who made you built healing into your very bones. He keeps you even in this small hurt, teaching your body to be strong, teaching you that pain can be survived." The child absorbed these lessons not as doctrine, but as reality, woven into the fabric of daily life. And Matthias watched with wonder as his son grew in both body and spirit, becoming a child who knew how to be afraid and yet trust, who could acknowledge difficulty and yet believe in care. Other children came in time. A daughter they named Hannah, after Matthias's grandmother, who had blessed his father before his first pilgrimage. Then another son, Simeon, named for the old man who had first spoken the psalm to Matthias by the spring. Each child was a gift, each name a remembrance, each life a continuation of blessing passed down through generations. As his family grew, so did Matthias's role in the community. He was not a rabbi or a priest, not formally educated in the schools of Jerusalem, but people recognized in him a wisdom that came from lived experience, a faith that had been tested and proven. They came to him with their questions, their struggles, their doubts, A young couple on the verge of divorce sought his counsel. Matthias listened to their grievances, their hurts, their anger, and then he told them about Miriam, about how there had been a time during the drought when the stress had driven them to the edge of breaking, how they had learned that keeping each other meant more than protecting each other from hardship. It meant walking together through hardship, refusing to let go even when letting go seemed easier. The psalm says, "The Lord keeps your going out and your coming in." Matthias said to them, "In marriage, you are called to do the same for each other, to watch over each other's comings and goings, to be present when your spouse goes out into difficulty, and to be there when they come home seeking shelter. This is not easy, but it is the keeping that makes covenant real." An elderly man facing death came to Matthias in his final weeks. He was afraid, uncertain about what lay beyond, struggling with the approach of the end. Matthias sat with him for many hours over many days, and they spoke of faith and fear, of life and death, of what it meant to trust when standing at the ultimate threshold. "All my life," the old man said one afternoon, "I have heard the psalm. The Lord will keep your going out and your coming in from this time forth and forevermore. But now I am about to go out in a way I have never gone out before. I am leaving this life. Will the keeping continue even there?" "The psalm does not say, 'until you die,'" Matthias replied gently. "It says, 'forevermore.' Forever means forever. Your going out from this life is still a going out that is watched over. Your coming in to whatever lies beyond is still a coming in that is guarded. The keeper does not sleep, not in life, and not in death, not in time, and not beyond time." Thus the old man died peacefully a week later, and his family said that he had been at peace in his final days, his fear replaced by a quiet confidence. At the funeral, Matthias was asked to speak, and he recited the psalm in full, his voice steady and clear, and the words seemed to wrap around the mourners like a comforting embrace. Part 5. The Full Circle. Continued. Chapter 1. Return to Jerusalem. When Nathan was 7 years old, Matthias decided it was time to make another pilgrimage to Jerusalem, and this time he would take his son with him. Miriam agreed, though Matthias could see the worry in her eyes as she helped prepare for their journey. "He is so young," she said the night before they were to leave. "The road is long and there are dangers. I was 17 when I made my first journey." Matthias reminded her gently, "And I was alone. Nathan will have me with him, and more importantly, he will have the keeper watching over both of us." "I know," Miriam said. "I know, but knowing it in my mind and feeling peace about it in my heart are two different things." Matthias took her hands. "Then let me tell you what I learned during the drought. Faith is not the absence of fear. It is the choice to trust even when fear is present. You can be afraid for Nathan and still believe he is kept. Both things can be true at once." They left at dawn, father and son, their packs light but adequate for the journey. Nathan was excited, his energy boundless, asking 100 questions before they had even left sight of the village. Matthias answered patiently, remembering his own first journey, the mix of fear and wonder, the sense of stepping into something vast and unknown. The road was easier with a companion, Matthias discovered. Having Nathan with him meant he saw everything again through fresh eyes. The hills he had walked so many times became new when Nathan exclaimed over them. The spring where he had met Daniel so many years ago became a place of joy when Nathan splashed in the water and laughed. But the journey was not without its challenges. Nathan grew tired more quickly than Matthias had anticipated. His small legs could not cover as much ground, and they had to stop frequently for rest. One afternoon, As they were still several hours from the caravanserai where Matthias had planned to spend the night, Nathan began to cry from exhaustion. "Abba, I cannot walk any more," he said, his voice breaking. "My feet hurt too much." Matthias knelt and examined his son's feet. They were blistered, the skin rubbed raw by sandals that suddenly seemed inadequate. He felt a pang of guilt. Should he have waited another year? Should he have prepared Nathan better? But then he remembered his own blistered feet on his first journey, his own moments of wondering if he could continue. And he remembered what he had learned, that the journey was not about being strong enough on your own, but about discovering you were not alone. "Come," he said gently, and he lifted Nathan onto his shoulders. The boy was heavier than Matthias had expected, and he knew that carrying him for hours would be difficult. But this too was part of the keeping, bearing one another's burdens, offering strength when another had none left. As he walked with Nathan on his shoulders, Matthias began to sing softly, "I will lift up my eyes to the hills. From where does my help come? My help comes from the Lord, who made heaven and earth." Nathan's small voice joined his, thin and tired but genuine. "He will not let your foot be moved. He who keeps you will not slumber." They sang together as they walked, and the psalm became a rhythm that matched Matthias's steps, a companion that made the burden lighter. Other travelers they passed smiled to hear the father and son singing, and some joined their voices to the ancient words. When they finally reached the caravanserai, Matthias's shoulders ached and his legs trembled with fatigue, but Nathan, restored by rest and food, looked at his father with new eyes. "You carried me, Abba," he said wonderingly. "When I could not walk, you carried me?" "Yes," Matthias said, "and this is what the keeper does for us. When we cannot walk, when we have no strength left, we are carried, not abandoned to our weakness, but held and borne forward." The next morning, Nathan's feet were better, and they were able to continue. The remaining journey to Jerusalem passed without major incident. Though there were small lessons at every turn, Nathan learned about sharing when they met travelers with less food than they had. He learned about patience when they had to wait for a well to refill before they could draw water. He learned about kindness when they encountered a lame beggar, and Matthias stopped to tend the man's wounds and share their provisions. And then finally, they crested the final rise and saw Jerusalem spread before them. Nathan gasped, his small hand gripping Matthias's tightly. "It is so big," he whispered, "so bright." "Yes," Matthias said, his own heart full at seeing the city again, at being able to share this moment with his son. "And we are very small, but we are seen. We are known. We are kept." They entered the city together, and Matthias took Nathan through the same streets he had walked on his first pilgrimage. They climbed the steps to the Temple Mount, and Matthias watched his son's face as they passed through the gates into the court of the Gentiles, as the massive structure of the temple itself came into view. "Did God really live there?" Nathan asked, his voice hushed with awe. "God lives everywhere," Matthias said, "but this is a place where people come to remember that, to focus their hearts, to offer their prayers and their gratitude. It is a reminder, made of stone and gold, that we are not alone in the universe, that we are noticed, cared for, loved." They spent several days in Jerusalem, and Matthias made sure Nathan experienced everything he had experienced: the ritual bath, the prayers in the temple court, the singing of the Levites, the crowds of pilgrims from every nation. But he also made sure to let Nathan simply be a child, to play with other children they met, to explore the market stalls with wide eyes, to taste new foods and hear new languages, On their final evening in the city, as the sun was setting and the temple gleamed golden in the fading light, Matthias and Nathan sat together on the Mount of Olives, looking back at Jerusalem spread below them. "Abba," Nathan said thoughtfully, "I understand now why you wanted me to come here. But I also understand what you told me before we left, that God is not only in Jerusalem." "Tell me what you mean," Matthias prompted. "I mean that the keeping is everywhere. It was in Beth-Zur before we left. It was on the road when you carried me. It is here in Jerusalem, and it will be there when we go home. The place changes, but the keeping does not. Just like the psalm says, from this time forth and forevermore. That means it never stops, no matter where we are." Matthias felt his throat tighten with emotion. His 7-year-old son had grasped something that had taken him years to understand. "You are wise beyond your years, my son," he said softly. "Yes, that is exactly right. The keeping is constant, unchanging, present in every place and every moment. We came to Jerusalem not to find God, but to remember what we already had, His presence with us." "Then why do we go?" Nathan asked. "If He is already with us, why make the journey?" "Because sometimes we forget," Matthias said. "Sometimes the dailiness of life, the struggles and the work, make us forget what is most true. We come here to remember, to have our vision cleared, to drink deeply from the well of faith so that we can go back to our ordinary lives and see them as extraordinary. We come here to learn what we already knew but had stopped believing. Does that make sense?" "I think so," Nathan said. "It is like how Ima makes me wash my hands before meals. I know my hands are dirty, but I forget until she reminds me." "The journey reminds us." Matthias laughed, delighted by his son's analogy. "Yes, exactly like that. The journey washes our souls, clears our vision, reminds us of what is true." They sat together in companionable silence as the stars began to emerge overhead, one by one, then hundreds, then thousands. And Matthias thought about his own first journey, about the frightened boy who had stood on a rooftop in Beth-Zur and wondered if God was real. That boy was gone now, replaced by a man who knew, not from being told, but from experience, that he was watched over, cared for, kept. And now that man was passing the same truth to his son, and his son would one day pass it to his children, and the chain of blessing would continue, generation after generation, each one learning that they were not alone, that they were held, that they were loved with a love that would not let them go. Chapter 2. The Closing of the Circle. The journey home was different from the journey out. Nathan, having gained confidence from the pilgrimage, walked with less complaint. His feet toughened, his spirit strengthened. They retraced their steps, and at each place they had stopped on the way to Jerusalem, Nathan would remember something. "This is where we sang the psalm together," or "This is where you carried me," or "This is where we met the family with the lame donkey." Each memory was another layer of meaning, another thread woven into the tapestry of understanding. The journey had not been just about reaching a destination. It had been about what happened along the way, the lessons learned in each step, the relationship deepened between father and son. When they finally came within sight of Beth-Zur, Nathan began to run despite his tired legs, eager to see his mother and siblings. Miriam stood at the edge of the village waiting, and when she saw them, her face lit with relief and joy. Nathan threw himself into her arms, babbling excitedly about everything he had seen, the temple, the crowds, the city walls, the songs, the stories. Miriam held him close, tears running down her face, and over his head her eyes met Matthias's. Thank you, he mouthed silently, for bringing him back safe. But Matthias shook his head slightly. Not me, he mouthed back, the keeper. That evening, as the family gathered for their meal, Nathan told his siblings everything about the journey, his words tumbling over each other in his excitement. Little Hannah listened with wide eyes, asking when she could go to Jerusalem. Baby Simeon simply smiled and clapped his hands, not understanding, but caught up in his brother's joy. After the children were asleep, Matthias and Miriam sat together in the courtyard as they had done countless times before. The night was cool and clear, the stars bright overhead, and the familiar sounds of the village settling for sleep surrounded them. "He is changed," Miriam observed quietly. "I can see it in his eyes. He went as a child and came back as something more. Not grown, but growing. Do you see it?" "I do," Matthias agreed. "The journey does that. It strips away the casual assumptions and replaces them with earned understanding. He learned that he is small and the world is vast. But he also learned that being small does not mean being unnoticed. That vastness does not equal indifference. He learned the psalm not as words, but as reality. "And you?" Miriam asked. "What did you learn this time?" Matthias considered the question. "I learned that the keeping continues in new forms. When I first walked to Jerusalem, I was learning to trust that I was kept. This time, carrying Nathan when he could not walk, I learned that I am part of that keeping. I am an instrument of the care I have received. The love flows through me, not just to me. I am kept so that I can keep, and someday Nathan will keep his own children, and they will keep theirs, and the chain continues forever. From this time forth and forevermore," Miriam quoted softly. "From this time forth and forevermore," Matthias echoed. They sat in comfortable silence, and Matthias reflected on the journey his life had taken, from a frightened boy to a man who had learned to trust, from solitary pilgrim to husband and father, from recipient of blessing to conduit of blessing. Each stage had built on the one before, each lesson had prepared him for the next, and through it all, the psalm had been his companion, his guide, his truth. He thought of the people who had shaped him, his father Joash, who had first sung the psalm to him, his mother Naomi, who had blessed him with the words of Mizpah, old Simeon, who had taught him that the words were not just comfort, but truth, Daniel, who had shown him that faith and fear could coexist, Levi, who had taught him about keeping others, Miriam, who had shown him that transformation could happen at home as well as on a road, Nathan, who was teaching him that wisdom must be passed on, or it dies. And he understood that his life was not his own separate story, but part of a much larger story, the story of a people who had learned over thousands of years that they were not alone, that the universe was not cold and indifferent, but warm with attention, alive with care, infused with love. The God who had made the hills that surrounded Beth-Zur was the same God who knew every hair on Nathan's head, every thought in Miriam's mind, every breath that Matthias drew. The God who had created the vast expanse of stars overhead was the same God who noticed when a sparrow fell, who saw tears shed in darkness, who heard prayers whispered in desperation. This was the heart of the psalm, the core truth that all the words circle around. You are not alone. You have never been alone. You will never be alone. From before your birth until after your death and beyond into eternity, you are seen, known, loved, and kept. Chapter 3. Final meditation years continued to pass, as years do. Matthias grew older. his hair beginning to gray at the temples, his hands showing the wear of decades of work. His children grew, and eventually Nathan himself married and had children of his own. The household that had once been just Matthias and Miriam expanded to include sons and daughters-in-law, grandchildren who called him Saba, and climbed into his lap to hear stories. The stories he told were always the same ones, and yet never quite the same. The journey to Jerusalem, the drought and the rain, the people he had met, the lessons he had learned. Each telling brought out different details, emphasized different aspects, because Matthias himself was still learning, still discovering new layers of meaning in experiences he had lived decades before. The psalm remained central to his life and to his family's life. They recited it together each morning and evening. They sang it at weddings and births. They whispered it at sickbeds and graves. It became the rhythm of their existence, the thread that connected all the disparate moments of joy and sorrow, ease and struggle, into a coherent whole. When Matthias was in his 50s, his father Joash died peacefully in his sleep, having lived to see his grandchildren and great-grandchildren. At the funeral, Matthias stood beside the grave and recited the psalm in full, his voice strong despite his grief. And as he spoke the final words, "The Lord will keep your going out and your coming in from this time forth and forevermore," he understood them in a new way. His father had gone out from this life, and he had been kept in that going out, just as he had been kept in all the goings out and comings in of his long life. Death was not abandonment. It was not the end of the keeping. It was simply another threshold, another passage, and the keeper stood on both sides of it. The realization brought not sorrow, but peace, deep, abiding peace that allowed grief its place, but did not let grief become despair. His father was kept, had always been kept, would always be kept. Nothing, not even death, could separate them from the love of the keeper. As Matthias himself grew older, he found his role in the community shifting again. He became one of the elders, sought out not just for spiritual wisdom, but for practical counsel on village matters. He helped settle disputes, advised on crops and flocks, officiated at ceremonies, taught the young men preparing for their own first pilgrimages. But his greatest joy remained his own family, watching his grandchildren grow, teaching them the same lessons his father had taught him, passing on the wisdom earned through his own journey. He would take them into the hills as Joash had taken him, point out the same landmarks, tell them about the keeper who never slept. One evening, when Matthias was nearly 60 years old, he sat on the roof of his house, the same roof where he had sat as a young man before his first pilgrimage, where he had sat with his father before dawn, where he had made the decision to undertake the journey that had changed his life. The sun was setting, painting the hills in shades of gold and rose and purple. The air was cool and sweet with the scent of olive blossoms. In the courtyard below, he could hear the voices of his family. Miriam directing the preparation of the evening meal, grandchildren playing, sons and daughters-in-law talking and laughing, and Matthias felt such overwhelming gratitude that tears came to his eyes. Not tears of sadness, but of wonder. He had been so young when he began this journey, so uncertain, so afraid. He had set out seeking proof of God's existence, seeking to know if faith was real or merely tradition. And he had found his answer, not in a single moment of revelation, though there had been such moments, but in the accumulation of thousands of small confirmations, each day bringing new evidence of being watched over, cared for, kept. He had been kept through fear and doubt. kept through the long road to Jerusalem, kept through encounters with strangers who became teachers, kept through the valley of shadow, kept through the revelation in the temple, kept through the drought that had threatened to destroy everything, kept through the births of his children and the death of his father, kept through illness and health, plenty and want, joy and sorrow. Every single day of his life had been a demonstration of the truth of the psalm. Every breath had been a gift. Every step had been guided. Every moment had been held in a love that would not, could not, let him go. He lifted his eyes to the hills, those ancient sentinels that had watched over his village for generations, and he whispered the words that had become not just familiar, but beloved. I will lift up my eyes to the hills. From where does my help come? The question hung in the air, and the answer came not as words, but as knowledge, deep and certain and unshakable. My help comes from the Lord, who made heaven and earth. The same Lord who had made these hills had made him. The same power that had set the stars in their courses had also set the rhythm of his heartbeat, had numbered the hairs on his head, had known him before he was formed in his mother's womb. And that power, that love, had never once looked away. He continued the psalm, his voice a whisper in the night. He will not let your foot be moved. He who keeps you will not slumber. Behold, he who keeps Israel will neither slumber nor sleep. Every stumble prevented, every fall caught, every dark night watched over by eyes that never closed, never grew weary, never turned away even for a moment. The Lord is your keeper. The Lord is your shade on your right hand. The sun shall not strike you by day, nor the moon by night. He had walked through burning days and cold nights, through seasons of plenty and seasons of want, through joy and sorrow, health and illness, and in all of it, every single moment, he had been held. The Lord will keep you from all evil. He will keep your life, not from all difficulty, not from all pain, but from evil, from the destruction of his soul, from losing himself in the darkness. His life, his essential self, the core of who he was, had been preserved, protected, kept. The Lord will keep your going out and your coming in from this time forth and forevermore. Forevermore. The word hung in the night air, vast and unending, not just for his lifetime, but beyond. Not just for him, but for his children and his children's children, stretching forward into eternity. The keeping had no end. The watchfulness knew no limit. The love would never cease. Matthias sat in silence as the night deepened around him, and he felt a peace so profound it seemed to emanate from the very stones beneath him, from the air he breathed, from the stars that watched overhead. Below, in the courtyard, the sounds of his family had quieted. Dinner was finished. Children were being put to bed. Miriam's voice drifted up, singing a lullaby to little Simeon, and the melody wrapped around Matthias's heart like a warm embrace. This was his life, this simple, ordinary, sacred life. And it was enough, more than enough. It was abundance beyond measure. He thought of the young man he had been, standing on this very roof so many years ago, wondering if the journey to Jerusalem would give him the answers he sought. And he smiled, because now he understood that the journey had not given him answers. It had given him something far better. It had given him experience. It had transformed questions into knowing, doubt into trust, fear into peace. The journey had made the psalm real, and in making it real, it had shown him that the entire world was sacred ground, that every moment was a gift, that every breath was a prayer, that every person he encountered was beloved by the same God who loved him. Prologue. The keeping continues. Many more years passed, as years always do, like water flowing steadily toward the sea. Matthias grew old, his hair white as wool, his hands gnarled but still strong, his eyes clear and full of the light that comes from a life well lived. His children grew and married and had children of their own. His grandchildren grew and began to have children. The house that had once held just him and Miriam now echoed with multiple generations, each one learning the psalm, each one hearing the stories, each one discovering in their own time what it meant to be kept. Matthias became the elder of Beth-Zur, respected not for position or wealth, for he had neither, but for wisdom born of experience, for peace that radiated from his presence, for the gentle way he guided those who sought his counsel. People would come to him with their burdens, their questions, their fears, and he would listen with the patience of one who knew that being heard was sometimes more important than being answered. He would offer what wisdom he had, always pointing back to the psalm, always reminding them that they were not alone, that they were watched over, that they were kept. Young men preparing for their first pilgrimage to Jerusalem would seek him out, and he would tell them about his own first journey, about the fear and the wonder, about the lessons learned in the valley of shadow, about the moment in the temple when everything became clear. And he would send them off with the same blessing his father had given him, the same words that had accompanied him every step of the way. Young couples struggling in their marriages would come, and he would tell them about the drought, about how he and Miriam had learned that being kept meant keeping each other, that love was a choice renewed daily, that difficulties could become teachers if approached with humility and trust. Parents, grieving children who had strayed, would seek his wisdom, and he would remind them that the keeper watched over their wayward ones too, that the love of God was longer than any path of rebellion, that the psalm promised keeping from this time forth and forevermore was a very long time indeed. Those facing death, whether their own or that of loved ones, would come to him in their final days, seeking comfort, and Matthias would sit with them, his old hand holding theirs, and he would recite the psalm slowly, reverently, letting each word carry its full weight of promise. And he would tell them what he had learned, that the keeping did not end at death's threshold, that forevermore meant exactly what it said, that the keeper did not sleep, even when they passed from this life to the next. And slowly, imperceptibly, the understanding that Matthias carried spread through Beth-Zur and into the surrounding villages. It was not something taught as doctrine, but caught as reality. It spread through stories and songs, through the way families prayed together, through the peace that rested on certain households like a benediction. The psalms ceased to be merely words recited by rote and became instead the lived experience of a community that had learned to trust, to watch over one another, to keep and be kept. On a cool evening in early autumn, when Matthias was well into his 80s, he climbed to the roof of his house one final time. His joints protested, and he moved slowly, but he was determined. This had been his place of encounter for so many years, where he had first heard his father sing the psalm, where he had decided to make his first pilgrimage, where he had watched countless sunsets and greeted innumerable dawns. Miriam had gone before him 3 years earlier, slipping peacefully from sleep into eternity with a smile on her face. He missed her every day, but there was no despair in his missing, only gratitude for the years they had shared and quiet anticipation of the reunion that awaited. His children and grandchildren knew where to find him. They gave him space, understanding that he needed this time alone, but they remained nearby, honoring him with their presence and their patience. Matthias sat on the roof as the sun descended toward the western hills, painting the sky in shades of copper and gold and deep purple. The landscape he had known his entire life spread before him, the terraced slopes, the olive groves, the distant peaks, the familiar paths worn smooth by generations of feet. And he lifted his eyes to the hills, not because he needed to ask where his help came from. He knew now, knew with a certainty that transcended mere belief, but because it had become his prayer, his meditation, his way of orienting himself in the world. "I will lift up my eyes to the hills," he said, his voice thin with age but steady with conviction. "From where does my help come?" The question hung in the air, rhetorical now, answered by decades of experience. "My help comes from the Lord, who made heaven and earth." And as he spoke these words, Matthias felt a presence so real, so tangible, that tears sprang to his eyes. Not a vision, not a voice from the clouds, but simply an awareness, deep and unshakable, that he was not alone, had never been alone, would never be alone. The Keeper was present, here, now, in this moment, just as he had been present in every moment that had come before. Present in the fear of that first journey, present in the encounter at the spring, present in the valley of shadow, present in the revelation at the temple, present in the drought, present in the births and deaths, present in the joys and sorrows, present in the daily bread and the nightly rest, always present, always watching, always keeping. "He will not let your foot be moved," Matthias continued, and he thought of all the times his feet had been kept steady, all the stumbles that had been prevented, all the falls that had been caught. "He who keeps you will not slumber. Behold, he who keeps Israel will neither slumber nor sleep." Through every dark night of his long life, through every moment of uncertainty, the Keeper had maintained his watch. While Matthias slept, while he worried, while he doubted, while he wandered, through all of it, the Keeper's eyes had never closed. The Lord is your keeper. The Lord is your shade on your right hand. Protection, presence, partnership, not a distant deity watching from afar, but a close companion walking at his right hand, the place of honor and intimacy. "The sun shall not strike you by day, nor the moon by night." He had walked through fire and ice, through heat and cold, through light and darkness, and he had survived. More than survived, he had thrived, not because he was strong, but because he was held. The Lord will keep you from all evil. He will keep your life, his essential self. The core of who he was had been preserved through every storm. He was still Matthias, still himself, still able to love and hope and trust, because the Keeper had kept what mattered most. The Lord will keep your going out and your coming in from this time forth and forevermore. Forevermore. The word echoed in his heart, and Matthias understood that he was standing at his final threshold, not with fear, but with anticipation. This, too, was a going out, his last great journey. And just like that first pilgrimage to Jerusalem so many decades ago, he would not walk it alone. The Keeper would go with him. The Keeper would keep his going out from this life, just as he had kept his going out from Beth-Zur all those years ago. The Keeper would keep his coming into whatever lay beyond, just as he had kept his coming into Jerusalem, from this time forth and forevermore. The sun touched the horizon, and the world was bathed in golden light. And in that light, Matthias saw not just the hills of his homeland, but something more, something beyond, something that made his heart swell with longing and peace simultaneously. "Thank you," he whispered. Thank you for keeping me. Thank you for the journey. Thank you for every step, every lesson, every moment. Thank you for making it all real. The stars began to emerge one by one, just as they had on that first night in the wilderness when he had been so afraid. But now, looking at them, he felt only peace. Those same stars had watched over him then. They watched over him now, and they would watch over his children and grandchildren after he was gone. The keeping continued, always had, always would. Below, he heard soft footsteps on the ladder, and Nathan's head appeared over the edge of the roof. His son, no longer young, now well into middle age himself, with silver threading through his dark hair, climbed up and sat beside his father. They sat in silence for a long time, watching the darkness deepen and the stars multiply, father and son sharing the same contemplative peace. Finally, Nathan spoke softly. "Will you teach me one more time, Abba? The psalm?" Matthias smiled, his weathered face creasing with joy. "I will, but this time you lead. I will follow." And so Nathan began, his voice strong and clear in the night air. "I will lift up my eyes to the hills. From where does my help come?" Matthias joined his voice to his son's, the two of them speaking in unison. "My help comes from the Lord, who made heaven and earth. He will not let your foot be moved. He who keeps you will not slumber. Behold, he who keeps Israel will neither slumber nor sleep. The Lord is your keeper. The Lord is your shade on your right hand. The sun shall not strike you by day, nor the moon by night. The Lord will keep you from all evil. He will keep your life. The Lord will keep your going out and your coming in from this time forth and forevermore." The words settled into the night like a blessing, and Matthias felt complete. The circle had closed. The wisdom had been passed. The keeping would continue. He reached over and took Nathan's hand, squeezing it gently. "You will teach your children," he said, "and they will teach theirs. And the truth will continue, generation after generation, not because we are faithful, but because he is. Not because we keep watching, but because he never stops." "Yes, Abba," Nathan said, his voice thick with emotion. "I will teach them. I promise." They sat together until the night grew cold and the stars filled the entire sky, a vast tapestry of light bearing witness to the conversation below. And when Matthias finally descended from the roof for the last time, moving slowly with Nathan's supporting hand, he carried with him a peace that was complete and unshakable. Because, 3 days later, Matthias died quietly in his sleep, surrounded by his family, his lips curved in a gentle smile, his hand resting over his heart. At his funeral, the entire village of Beth-Zur came, along with people from villages throughout the region, people whose lives he had touched, whose burdens he had helped carry, whose faith he had strengthened simply by being who he was. Nathan stood beside the grave and recited the psalm in full, his voice not breaking even once, because he had learned from his father that grief and peace could coexist, that death was not abandonment, but transition, that the keeping continued even beyond the grave. And as the community responded with Amen, as the earth was placed over Matthias's body, as the prayers were spoken and the blessings pronounced, there was sorrow, but not despair. There was loss, but not hopelessness. There was an ending, but also a continuation. For they all understood what Matthias had spent his life teaching, that this was not truly goodbye, but until we meet again, that the keeping did not end, that forevermore meant exactly what it said. Years passed, decades, generations. The stories of Matthias became legend in Beth-Zur, passed down from parent to child, from grandparent to grandchild. The psalm remained the prayer of the community, spoken morning and evening, recited over cradles and graves, sung on journeys and whispered in darkness. And though the details of Matthias's life grew hazy with time, though his face was eventually forgotten and his voice no longer remembered, the truth he had lived remained crystalline and clear. We are not alone. We are watched over by the one who never sleeps. We are kept in a love that will not let us go, from this time forth and forevermore. Gather now, dear friend, as this story comes to its close, as the night deepens around you and sleep calls gently, know that this truth is not just for ancient pilgrims on dusty roads. It is for you, right here, right now, in this moment. The same keeper who watched over Matthias watches over you. The same love that held him through his journey holds you through yours. The same promise spoken millennia ago still echoes true today. I will lift up my eyes to the hills. From where does my help come? My help comes from the Lord, who made heaven and earth. He will not let your foot be moved. He who keeps you will not slumber. The Lord is your keeper. The Lord will keep your going out and your coming in, from this time forth and forevermore. So rest now. Rest in peace. Rest in the certainty that you are seen, known, loved, and kept. The keeper does not sleep, and you are safe forevermore. Amen.